Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our invitees and guests joining us both virtually as well as in person. I'm Nirukti Karyasam from ADB, and I will be your MC for this program. The Serendipity Knowledge Program, also known as SKOP, is an ADB initiative designed with the vision of becoming a knowledge solution bank for Sri Lanka by creating a platform to share knowledge on issues relevant to the nation and also allowing discussion among stakeholders. With this edition of SKOP, we launch the Asian Development Outlook for 2023, where we present the outlook for the Asia and the Pacific. Today's presentations will specifically focus on South Asia and Sri Lanka, and this will be followed by a panel discussion where we seek to deep dive into Sri Lanka's current economic challenges and the way forward. As I mentioned before, this is a hybrid event, and we do have participants joining us both virtually as well as in person. So in the interest of time, we have created a digital platform through which you can submit your questions for our Q&A sessions. For in-person attendees, there is a QR code on your table which will enable you to access this digital platform through which you can submit your questions. And for virtual participants, we will be posting the link on the chat for you to submit your questions. So without further ado, to kickstart today's proceedings, I call upon stage Mr. Chen Chen, Country Director of Sri Lanka Resident Mission for ADB, to present the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Nirukti. Yeah, I saw still participants are coming to the room, so I hope they will be able to join us timely. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a welcome to all the online participants. Greetings from Colombo. I'm very thrilled to be here today at the 5th edition of Serendipity Knowledge Program for Sri Lanka. In close coordination with the National Planning Department, Ministry of Finance, ADB initiated the Serendipity Knowledge Program, or SKOP, for Sri Lanka in 2021. This is one of the first among ADB's developing member countries. The program is designed to respond to the knowledge demands of the country. SKOP is the main vehicle for ADB to help the country in funding knowledge solutions. We also welcome our development partners to join us in subjects of mutual interest. Today's event is special as it coincides with the launch of Asian Development Outlook 2023, which is a flagship knowledge product of ADB for the whole region of Asia and the Pacific. Today's event is even more special because it coincides with almost the end of the first year of Sri Lanka's economic crisis. We hope this event will signify a bright and prosperous future of the country. I must first congratulate the country for securing the approval of the IMF Extended Fund Facility just 2 weeks back. We acknowledge the hard work of the leaders, the policymakers, the government officials, and the people for taking decisive actions at a crucial juncture. It helped contain the pace of economic deterioration in 2022. Now the hard work continues for Sri Lanka. As a well-known saying goes, never waste a good crisis. We urge Sri Lanka to turn this crisis into an opportunity and go for the deep, comprehensive reforms to address the long-standing issues inflicting on the economy. It's important that Sri Lanka stays the course. And for us at ADB, we will remain steadfast in our support. In 2022, ADB provided emergency support through the repurposing of committed fund to sustain basic service and livelihood, and to mitigate the impact of the economic crisis on the people, particularly on the poor and vulnerable groups. We also supported essential trade, including the imports of medicine, the fertilizers. We worked very closely with the government, the private sector, the civil society, and the development partners to maximize the impact of our emergency assistance. We will continue this collaborative approach in ADB's future assistance to Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, now, 1 year into the unprecedented crisis, of course, we hope the worst is already behind us. There are always lessons to learn from the crisis. This is what today's keynote speech will reflect on. We are honored to have Mr. Nandala Wickramasinghe, the Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, to speak on the early lessons learned from steering the economy through a crisis. After his keynote speech, ADB team will present our outlook for the whole region of Asia and the Pacific. Then they will zoom in on the sub-region of South Asia, and particularly on Sri Lanka. Moving beyond the near-term outlook, the main question remains on tackling the long-standing challenges and the way forward for Sri Lanka. We will have a panel discussion to take a deep dive into this question. I appreciate the presence of the Secretary to the Treasury, who will join us very soon, Mr. Srivardana, the Chairperson of Haitian National Bank, Ms. Aruni Gunitilaka, and the virtual participation of Dr. Shamini Kaur. She is a member of the Presidential Advisory Group. Also will join this panel discussion is our Deputy Country Director and the Principal Country Economist, Mr. Utsaf Kumar. We are also very happy to have with us a special address from the IMF Resident Representative for Sri Lanka, Dr. Savad Jahan, who will give a speech on the recently approved extended fund facility arrangement. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope today's discussion and the insights into ADB's outlook for 2023 will help each of you who have joined our event physically and virtually understand and navigate the uncertainties that lie ahead. In the Q&A sessions, I would like to encourage everyone to make full use of the esteemed panelists and speakers we have lined up for you today. Sri Lanka has come a long way in the past year, but there is a long road to recover ahead. I wish all of you a very productive session this morning, which will help us in the future. Istuti, Nandri, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chinchen. Next up, it is my honor to invite on stage Dr. Nandalal Wickramasinghe, the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, to deliver the keynote address.
Good morning. First of all, let me thank the ADB, especially our Representative Chenchen and others for inviting me for this important event, which is the launching of Regional Outlook. That's an annual event that we have seen in the past also. And also like to recognize the resource persons who are in person as well as joining online, the eminent panel. I hope that there will be a good discussion. I think when I was asked to talk about, have a speech here, I was asked by Chen Chen, it's mainly steering the economy through a crisis, early lessons learned. This is something I think I have spoken several times. Anyway, let me just share a few ideas of this, especially for the benefit of learning lessons out of the crisis that we have gradually coming out, not out of the wood yet, but still making some progress. So I think for us to learn lessons, I think first of all we need to understand why we basically had this deep economic crisis, especially last year, and we all know the reasons have been mainly major reason, as I see always, is the long-term economic imbalances. Especially the root cause is the fiscal imbalance that we have been having for long periods, and then relating to that has caused current account balance of the balance of payments. There are strong empirical evidence to say that the structural fiscal balances and the current account balance have a strong association. We have seen empirical evidence even for Sri Lanka. That's some of the work that a lot of researchers have done. So Sri Lanka is a classic case of twin deficit country for a long period of several decades, and as a result we have been experiencing recurring balance of payment crisis. This is why, as we all know, we have been seeking balance of payment or BOP, balance of payment bailout packages for 16th time, then the second 17th time. Why this is different 17th time is we are not only balance of payment crisis, we are on a debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis, both coming together. That's why it is much more difficult and complex this time compared to 16 times that we had in the past. And then we had to think about, look at why we had to repeatedly, going back to 16 times is mainly, the reason has been we have never been able to address on a permanent basis the fiscal imbalance. And I can remember several IMF programs that I was also involved several times earlier due to my career at the central bank. Every time the key theme of any fiscal, any IMF program was revenue-based fiscal consolidation and some structural reforms related to fiscal imbalances. That was the idea. And then on the basis we had some monetary and exchange rate external sector policies and building up reserves. These are the kind of key themes. But what we have been doing mainly, we agree to a certain policy package with the IMF, and we get some money, and then then get some stabilization at the beginning, or sometimes you have completed 2-3 year programs successfully. For example, 2009 to 12 after the end of the war, but soon after completing the program, or even in between, once economy stabilizes, we have forgotten why we took this, why we agreed to this package, and take another 2 steps backwards. And then we're going back to the same kind of crisis, which is this fiscal imbalance, high fiscal deficit, high debt, and causing current account imbalances, and then depleting reserves, exchange rate depreciation, and repeating cycles for all these things. And this time, it was continuously happening. This is where we came into what they call sovereign debt, unsustainable situation. And because we did not take, even last 16 times, we were little more prudent. When we saw the crisis coming up, balance of payment crisis, we sought IMF bailout and at least got out of the stabilized economy without getting into this kind of a deep economic crisis that everyone felt the pain of this crisis. Whereas last 16 times, a lot of people, even general public, didn't feel the pain. A lot of people didn't know that there was a kind of pending balance of payment crisis. So we took early actions and at least stabilized the situation without addressing long-term structural issues. So this time, I think the lesson, first lesson I have to basically say is that this is something that I also shared when we were at the Washington DC at the similar event. IMF Regional Outlook was launched during the meeting times, ISPO meetings and annual meetings. So I was asked, what's the lesson we can learn? I said, for all the countries in the region and any country, that what we can learn from Sri Lanka is to take proactive measures before you go into or getting into this deep crisis. Take action proactively and seek whatever assistance early, so that people wouldn't feel and people wouldn't feel so much of pain as a result of crisis. But we were somehow too late and waited until March 2022 at least to seek a bailout assistance from the IMF. Obviously, seen even 2 years before, our debt was not sustainable, and we were going into debt crisis. On top of the balance of payment crisis that we already see by the time even 2020, 2021, even 2022. So we were too late. Because we were too late, that is why country had to go through this very, very difficult, painful process. We contracted, inflation went to 70%, and all what we did to prevent a sharp contraction, and collapse in the economy, and hyperinflation, and see social and political unrest. At least we had some, but continuation of those kind of instability, both political, economic, and collapsing economy, was prevented. This is something, at least with a lot of pain that we went through. I have seen a lot of analysts are talking about making allegation central bank contracted the economy as a result of our tight monetary policies and other policies. I think my argument is that not that we contracted. As a balance of payment shortage and crisis, economy was going to be collapsed instead of this contraction. We were able to minimize the contraction and limited this to 7.8% last year, compared to all the projections were. Sometimes even IMF in September had 8.7% contraction. World Bank had 9.2%. I thought ADB also had something similar. We also thought we wouldn't be able to at least over 8% in our predictions, knowing that the tight policy that we took early from April, but we were able to manage the contraction just below 8%. It's not a happy situation, but still able to minimize the contraction and pain to the economy, and also prevented hyperinflation. Food inflation went to 95%, and overall inflation went to 70%, and everyone thought inflation would be over 100%. It was going like a spiral, wage inflation spiral, and inflation expectations was too high, and as a result inflation was rising fast. But we were able to manage that also and prevented hyperinflation by cutting at 70%. And this is the outcome, but we have to learn, and also this is also important to understand what the policies, tight policies, not on the central bank, the fiscal policies, other structural pricing policies by the electricity board and the CPC and gas, all these utility adjustments. The immediate adjustment necessary to get the right prices just to address the bleeding from the fiscal policy, and also address the revenue and the expenditure, and address the expansive monetary financing, which is a result, which is the root cause of the inflation we already had last year. So we were able to manage the situation. So the key lesson to me is that for any country, we have to take proactive actions. And second, the lesson from Sri Lanka situation is that we can't again go back to the IMF because we are in this time is a social situation where, as I said earlier, balance of payment crisis as well as debt crisis. So when you look at the experience of other countries, especially that's what we have to learn, that countries, those who have not been able to recover out of sovereign debt crisis, if we are if we won't be able to get it right the first time, it will be a long, drawn battle. Even if you have look at some countries like Greece, took several years, even with the several IMF programs, still, now they have stabilized with a lot of painful reforms, pain in the economy for longer, protracted periods. But for Sri Lanka, I don't think we have a second chance this time. We need to get it right this time, and we cannot afford to do whatever we did earlier, take one step forward and stabilize, and take 2 steps backwards. This time, we have no chance. If we do that, that would be a grave mistake for the whole country. This is why we need to have a strong commitment from everyone, all stakeholders of this country, to take forward the next 4-year external fund facility, the commitments that government and the central bank, we as a country forwarded, submitted and promised and committed, and deliver in the same path. And probably it's better if we can perform better than what we have presented. I think, to me, if we have a commitment, we can overperform the targets that we have been set under the IMF program. That is the target we should be aiming at, so that people can come out of this crisis, economy can grow faster, can restore the sustainability faster. Those are the necessary elements to ensure that we go in the same direction continuously, at least next 3-4 years, and try to outperform the outlook that we have seen. I think we have some experience at the beginning. As I said earlier, for 2020, we were able to outperform the targets set by the IMF, even for this year, with difficult year, as I said, in terms of growth, in terms of inflation, in terms of fiscal deficit, and a lot of things, and even some of the reforms we have been able to implement so far on time. There was only delay about 3 months because of the delay in obtaining financing assurances from our bilateral partners. But I think still it is a record time from the staff level agreement reaching on 1st of September, and within about 6 months we were able to get the financing assurance. Our next crucial step in the near term is to finalize debt restructuring process and complete this part, so that next part would be then stabilize the restore the sustainability on a medium to long term basis, so that we can see a stable fiscal path going forward and trying to reach what they call fiscal primary surplus on the long term basis, steady long term basis, and restore the sustainability, and with higher growth path that envisaged by the IMF under their baseline scenario, which is about reaching 3% on average in the steady state growth. In my view, we have capacity to grow well above 3% if we do it right. This is why I think we can outperform quite easily if we do it right. But if we get it wrong, it would be a disaster. I think it would be a worse situation than we had last year, because this time, if we do not deliver what we have committed, there will be no excuses from our creditors. We won't have any access to the credit markets for a long period. And also, we can't get out of this crisis by ourselves without having external support, especially the IMF package plus other partners like World Bank, ADB, and our creditors, official creditors. Their supports and relief is necessary. And for us to ensure that they will continue to support, we have to ensure from our part we deliver our commitments. This is not the commitments, or I don't say these are the conditions of the IMF. These are our commitments to our external creditors, including the IMF, to show that this is our share of contribution. And if we deliver our commitments, then we deserve to ask a relief from our creditors, with an expectation of at least they can also recover whatever the relief they are going to give us in the short term. In the long term, both of us can benefit out of the short-term relief as a long-term benefit for our creditors as well as for the country. This is the win-win situation. So this is the thing, and the challenges, as I said, the last part of road ahead and other program challenges is obviously first immediate challenge is to, I think we are confident that we can meet that challenge, is to complete the debt restructuring process sooner, and then go on the path of the steady path in the same direction continuously to implement all the programs and restore the sustainability, have fiscal balances, have monetary, prudent monetary policy and proper exchange rate policy, inflation targeting regime implemented properly. Independent central bank is a crucial part of this policy package, which is necessary for any successful implementation of macro policies. And also importantly, medium to long term structural reforms, plus the new pillar of this IMF program that we are committed is to address governance challenges and address the corruption vulnerabilities. This is also something that there will be a lot of discussion in the several years in the past. I think this is something that will improve confidence of the investor on Sri Lanka, having proper governance structures and addressing corruption vulnerabilities. And this part of that is having a strong institution in place, strengthening the independent institution like the central bank, like other agencies. That will certainly enhance the investor confidence that is necessary for us to recover from where we are now in the long-term basis. That is, I think, important pillar this time. And also the other important pillar is a social safety net. This is where ADB and World Bank has been supporting strongly on the protecting poor and vulnerable, especially in this kind of crisis situation. We know people who are worst affected in this crisis, the inflation, loss of employment, are low-income, poor and vulnerable, people who have fallen below the poverty line more than what we have seen in the last several previous years. So without protecting them, I think for us it will be difficult for us to maintain social instability. That is where it's important, one important pillar, other important pillar is providing social safety net. That is where it's important our tax package. We need to protect and sustain this tax package so that people who can afford to contribute in terms of tax income should be able to help the worst affected, the poor and vulnerable in this kind of situation. Finally, let me thank ADB, especially for their support during the difficult times. As Chen mentioned, the one thing is social support for social safety net and other emergency financing by repurposing their envelope and reallocating money for emergency purposes. I can remember at some point, difficult periods in last year, one time $140 million we got for social safety net, balance of payment support was a crucial lifeline we got at that point to finance a couple of the petroleum shipments. Those were waiting several days outside out harbor. We were looking for dollars. Luckily, last time I think I was in close contact with Chen asking when are we going to get money. Those were basically that emergency support at that difficult time were crucial and so helpful to minimize and manage the situation at that time, plus some export processing and remittances. In addition to those regular flows, ADB support was crucial, especially during difficult times. And also we had some issues that we were able to sort out with some of the banks not honoring the obligation. We were able to support, but still the ADB support at crucial time, and hopefully going forward now the IMF program unlocked. And next several years, their commitment to support the medium to long-term reforms is very important. Not only the ADB, the World Bank and other agencies hopefully coming back. And this is where the next, the sustainability, basically reducing our debt burden, especially external debt burden, and stabilize the fiscal situation and provide more liquidity for treasuries to operate at reasonable interest rates. Next important step is to restructure our debt obligations. So these are the challenges and the lessons learned. I know there's an important panel, especially Shamini, who has a lot of experience in these programs. I'm sure she will share a lot more kind of in-depth analysis on the IMF programs and others. So let me stop here and wish you all the best for the best part of the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Veerasinghe, for those insightful words, particularly with regards to steering the economy through this crisis period and also the challenges ahead. Now, we will have the presentation of the Asian Development Outlook for 2023 for the Asia and the Pacific. For this event, let me call upon stage Mr. Irfan Qureshi, economist for the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of ADB, and also Mr. Rana Hassan, Regional Economic Advisor for the South Asia Department of ADB.
Got it. Good morning, everyone.
And Regional Cooperation Department of ADB, and also Mr. Rana Hassan, Regional Economic Advisor for the South Asia Department of ADB.
Got it. Good morning, everyone. Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on ADB's Development Outlook. My name is Irfan Qureshi, and I'm an economist with the Research Department at ADB. Let me first present to you the regional outlook before my colleague Rana Hassan discusses South Asia's outlook in more detail. So these are the key messages from our report, which was launched this morning. First, we expect the PRC's reopening to improve regional prospects. Second, manufacturing and exports gradually weakened late last year as activity in advanced economies softened. But recent business indicators show progress. Third, the PRC's recovery and healthy domestic demand will support expansion in the region this year and next. Growth in developing Asia as a region is projected to rise from 4.2% in 2022 to 4.8% in both 2023 and 2024. Fourth, as supply pressures have partly faded, inflation is projected to decline from 4.4% in 2022 to 4.2% in 2023 and 3.3% in 2024, coming down gradually towards pre-pandemic levels. Fifth, there is an upside risk that the boost from reopening in the PRC could be stronger than expected, but the region faces several challenges, including heightened financial stability risks, continued policy tightening in advanced economies, and the uncertain evolution of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me now walk you through these points in more detail. So let's start with a quick look at the region's performance last year. So this chart shows the half-year growth rates in 2022 for 10 major economies, which comprise about 90% of the region's GDP. Two main patterns can be observed. There's a lot going on in this chart, but let me just point to two main patterns. As the global outlook worsened in advance, mostly led by slowing down of economic activity in advanced economies, net exports from the region fell and growth decelerated in key tech exporters, including the Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Taipei, China. This is shown by the orange segments in the bars. Growth was strong in the ASEAN 4 economies, and this you can see mostly on the right-hand side of the chart. Consumption, which is shown in green, and investment, which is shown in blue, drove the expansion in some of these economies, including Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, especially in the second half of the year. So the impact of this softening external demand is visible in industrial output trends. The left-hand side chart shows that industrial production expanded for most of 2022, but gradually weakened late in the year. So first of all, in the key tech exporters, again, the same pattern is observed. Industrial output first decelerated and then even contracted in the fourth quarter, so consistent with the pattern we were seeing in the previous slide. However, on the right-hand side chart, we have a heat map for PMI indices. So green indicates improvement compared to the previous month, and red a worsening. India, Thailand, and the Philippines, which you can see from the top of the table, saw continued improvement last year, driven by reopening tailwinds. In contrast, activity in the PRC was disrupted by repeated lockdowns before its reopening in December. PMIs worsened in key tech exporters, and those you can see in the bottom of the table, since the last quarter of 2022. Readings from February show rising PMIs in most economies, and this partly reflects spillovers from the PRC's reopening on tourism and export orders in the region. Goods export tell a similar story. So on the left-hand side chart shows nominal merchandise exports for the PRC, which is in red, key tech exporters in green, and developing Asia, excluding the PRC, in blue. Following a very strong recovery since 2021, exports dropped in late 2022 as global growth weakened and consumer spending in advanced economies continued rotating from goods to services. Tourism, on the other hand, continues recovering. The right-hand side chart shows that visitor arrivals in developing Asia rebounded last year and are on track to return to pre-pandemic levels in most subregions this year, thanks in part due to PRC's reopening. Let me now move on to the financial conditions. So several indicators showed improvement since November last year, but renewed tightening in February and March reversed some of these gains. The left-hand side chart shows that stock market volatility, proxied here by the WIX index, which is the orange line, declined from November 2022. This was driven by expectations of a less hawkish stance by the US Fed. The blue line shows how this was reflected in rising equity markets in developing Asia. But the easing of financial conditions lost momentum in February, owing to renewed uncertainty over monetary tightening by the Fed to fight stubborn inflation. In March, conditions worsened further as concerns over the banking systems in the US and Europe spread. The right-hand side chart, on the other hand, shows regional exchange rates against the US dollars. As you can see from the blue segments of the bars, currencies depreciated by more than 10% last year. The pattern changed as expectations of less aggressive tightening by the Fed took hold. More than half of the currencies have appreciated since last October, which can be seen in the green bars. Let me now move to the outlook, starting with a brief discussion of our baseline assumptions that pin down our growth forecast. And then I'll talk about the growth outlook and the inflation outlook a little bit. So first of all, we expect the global headwinds that constrained growth in developing Asia last year to persist this year. The leftmost chart shows monetary tightening will likely decelerate in the US, which you can see from the green dots, and euro area, which you can see from the blue dotted line, but policy rates will remain high. This will dent growth in advanced economies this year as well. The middle chart shows that oil and gas prices are forecast to remain higher than before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as EU sanctions on Russia further tightened in December and January. Similarly, the rightmost chart shows that food prices have declined, but will likely remain elevated this year. On the plus side, reopening is expected to revive growth in the PRC this year. And the impact of that will be felt on the region. So this reopening will boost regional prospects through trade and other linkages such as tourism. The left-hand side chart shows that since the PRC abandoned its zero-COVID policy in December, the number of subway passengers has exceeded pre-pandemic levels. This is one indicator that suggests that domestic mobility has returned to normal in the PRC. On the other hand, the right-hand side chart shows that the associated rebound in economic activity varies across sectors. So services, which you can see in the red line, are seeing the largest boost, driven by contact-intensive sectors such as hospitality, leisure, and transport. This is very consistent with the pattern we saw in other economies that reopened last year, including the ASEAN economies. So manufacturing, which is in blue, also picked up as supply chain issues resolved once lockdown disruptions have sort of faded. So on the back of these, on the back of these mechanisms, we forecast that growth in the PRC will accelerate from 3% last year to 5% this year and 4.5% in 2024. Our forecasts are very close to the government's own forecast for these years. So moving to the region. So as the region gradually emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, growth in all subregions is projected to normalize. But the outlook varies substantially across economies. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, we expect growth to slow after strong performance last year following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to inflows of Russian migrants and capital. So the report's special topic examines the reasons for this unexpected performance in more detail. Growth is projected to accelerate in East Asia, which is driven by the PRC, but the expansion will moderate in Republic of Korea and Taipei, China, on falling demand for electronics. Over there, we expect domestic demand to primarily lead growth this year and next. South Asia will remain the best performing subregion this year and next, driven by high growth in India, which is led by domestic demand, but growth will expand only slightly in Pakistan this year and contract in Sri Lanka. Growth will normalize in Southeast Asia as the boost from recovering tourism is offset by weak global demand, which weighs on exports. In the Pacific, commodity prices will weigh on growth in the PNG, which accounts for 70% of the sub-region's GDP, while the reopening of alternative tourism destinations will slow the expansion in Fiji, which accounts for the 20% of that particular sub-region. In the rest of the sub-region, growth will turn positive for the first time after 3 years, supported by resuming tourism and infrastructure projects. Let me now move on to the outlook for inflation. So we expect regional inflation to come down after peaking in the second half of last year, as shown in the left-hand side chart. Next year, it will fall back further, closer to pre-pandemic levels. Several factors will play a role, including base effects, easing supply chain constraints, and the slowdown in advanced economies, which will lower price pressures globally. But there is significant variation across economies, as shown in the right-hand side chart. Inflation remains well anchored in the PRC and moderate in several other economies, but price pressures will continue to be particularly elevated in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Lao PDR. Let me end with the risks to the outlook. The PRC's reopening poses an upside risk to the outlook, as it could generate a stronger than expected rebound in domestic consumption with positive regional spillovers through trade and tourism. We have special analysis on this scenario in the main report. However, the region faces multiple and several challenges. Slower than expected disinflation in advanced economies could prolong the global tightening cycle with repercussions on growth and outlook in developing Asia. Higher interest rates could expose vulnerabilities from elevated debt levels. Financial stability risks could stem from various sectors and undermine the growth outlook. In the main report, we study this scenario as well in more detail. Russia's invasion of Ukraine could further escalate, renewing food and energy security problems. Other challenges arise from the fracturing of global production, which could affect trade, employment, and productivity, and more frequent extreme weather events and the transition to net zero. This concludes the main part of our ADO 2023 on recent developments and outlook. Let me now hand over to my colleague Rana Hassan to talk about South Asia's outlook in more detail. Thank you.
That one is the next. Got it. Thank you very much, Irfan, and it's really a pleasure to be here. In fact, a privilege really to have so many experts, so many senior officials, and a large audience. So I'll take over from where my colleague Irfan left and focus in a bit on the South Asia portion. Now, you know, the one point that you would have clearly seen from the charts that Irfan talked about was really the substantial variation that we see across countries. And now, naturally, the situation that Sri Lanka is in is rather special. So in the first set of slides that I'll go over, I'll focus more on the other countries, and then towards the end, focus on Sri Lanka. So essentially, the big macro challenges for the region really have been inflation and pressures on the external front. So really, right across the board, whether you're talking about India or Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, very, very similar in a qualitative sense to what we've been seeing in Sri Lanka, minus the issue of the debt. So the good news is these pressures they've sort of crystallized, and you're going to see 2023 growth rates decline, but we do expect in 2024 some improvements. And essentially, I think, one of the things I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that really, for the medium term, it's not just an issue for Sri Lanka, it's really for the region as a whole. The policies each country has to follow, and really there is no exception on this. Domestic resource mobilization is really to be emphasized, and economic diversification. So when you look at our region and you compare it to, let's say, East Asia or Southeast Asia, one of the things that you're struck by is this lack of economic diversification in a relative sense. It's happened, but it needs to be much more. Now, just coming to the numbers, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but essentially, just a few key points. South Asia remains the fastest growing subregion in developing Asia. So, if you just compare the top two lines, so we've got developing Asia's growth rates right there. We've got the next line showing South Asia. And you'll see that the region has been the fastest growing, and it will continue to be to do so. But this is driven in a very, very big way by India, because India is accounting for about 80% of the GDP of the region, and so a lot gets driven by India. Just very quickly, if you were to compare 2022 and 2023 growth rates, you're going to see that essentially you're going to have declining growth rates. So Bangladesh sees a big decline, almost 2 percentage points, so it's going to go from 7.1 to 5.3. India also is declining from 6.8 that we expect for 2022 to 6.4. Maldives, a sharp decline, but still growing at 7.1%. Of course, the exception over here is Sri Lanka, which in fact is going to see a reduction in the rate of contraction of the economy. But the other pattern over here that's common everywhere is that 2024, we definitely expect this to be a better year. And one of the most important things is that we're hopeful that the global situation, whether it's energy prices or some of these global economic uncertainties, will be resolving. Now, here's a quick chart just to make a simple point. This chart basically compares the GDP had the region been growing at the rates that we saw, the average rates that we saw 4 to 5 years prior to the pandemic. So that's the black dotted line. The blue line are the actual GDP levels. Now, one thing that you can see is Bangladesh is an interesting outlier in that it never really was that badly affected by the crisis. And so Bangladesh's growth trajectory, actual growth trajectory, is pretty much, it's virtually identical to its trend growth rate, the pre-pandemic trend growth rate. But with that exception of Bangladesh, every single economy takes a hit. You see India beginning to converge to its pre-pandemic trend GDP, but you see some countries which are not converging. So an example over here is Nepal, to some extent Bhutan. You've got the case of Pakistan where there's divergence, and of course we do have the situation of Sri Lanka, which is going through a particularly acute crisis. So in other words, the bottom line is that yes, while for most of the economies the GDP levels today and forecast 2 years into the future are above what they were pre-pandemic, if your metric is really what GDP should have been had the pandemic not taken place, we have some catching up to do. Again, Bangladesh is the outlier. On inflation, I don't want to go into too much detail on this. Irfan has already talked about it, but really the two outliers are Pakistan and Sri Lanka. They're provided in the right-hand chart. And essentially what you see is 2022 has really not been a good year as far as inflation is concerned. 2023, in some cases, it's going to be a little worse. Bangladesh is an example, but that's more to do with the precise definitions of the fiscal year. But 2024, I think, is really the year where we're expecting inflation to come to its normal, what we would think is the more normal pre-pandemic levels. Current account balances, again, if you look at 21, 22, what you see is a lot of variation. So you do have economies like Bhutan and Maldives, which tend to run very high current account deficits. They will actually see reductions in their current account deficits, but these will still remain fairly elevated. On the other hand, you have countries like the rest of the countries where you've actually seen fairly large increases in current account deficits, with the exception of Sri Lanka. Now, just one point I'd like to make is, you might feel that India with a current account deficit of 2.9%, that's not much, but actually for the country it is. It's among the highest that we've seen in the last 10 years or so. Exchange rates, will not go into this in too much detail, but essentially, with the exception of Maldives, where we've actually seen a bit of appreciation, the trend really has been towards depreciations. And when you look at the gross reserves, what you see in the chart on the right is we've broken this down in terms of 3 time periods: January 2022, July 2022, and the latest a recent month. And what you'll see is that these reserves in terms of months of imports came down fairly sharply in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and quite sharply also in the case of India. Now, India, it wasn't so much of an issue because India's reserves are massive. So not only in just in absolute terms, but even in terms of just the cover, the months of import cover that India has were very high. They were exceeding actually 10%, 10 months of imports. These came down fairly dramatically to about 8. Led to a bit of concern amongst the authorities. There were interventions in the exchange rate market. Reserves came down sharply, but since then you've seen a rebound in reserves. The reserves have been building up. In the case of Bangladesh, and I'll get back to this in a bit, you do see some reduction, and this is a reduction which was of considerable concern to the authorities. It's a point at which they approached IMF, and the country now actually has several IMF programs that have started. Policy rates, the region really had no choice but to raise these policy rates as the Fed started raising its own rates as inflation was exceedingly high. And so you had this, the central banks faced with this unenvious task of having to fight, in a sense, 2 battles. The battle on the inflation front and certainly in the case of India, this battle to stem capital outflows. So you saw a lot of portfolio capital outflows, and they needed to raise interest rates to combat that. On fiscal policy, deficits are fairly large in the region, and they've widened for most of the economies. Now, the drawback over here is, and this is what's important for the region, is, and it's not just an issue of Sri Lanka, you'll notice that public debt, that's a chart on the right, are fairly high. So it may come as a surprise to some people, but countries like Bhutan and Maldives also, tremendously high debt. And in fact, in the case of Bhutan, a huge chunk of this debt is actually external debt. What makes the situation in Bhutan very different, though, is that a lot of Bhutan's debt, even though it's in foreign exchange, it's really tied to investments in hydropower and energy purchase agreements with India. So these are really directly linked to an investment that's paying off in returns, and the returns are pretty much assured, with India as the assured buyer. That makes Bhutan's case different, but Maldives is in a tough spot. The IMF's Article 4 mission and debt sustainability analysis that was done has shown that this is a country where the debt is high and it is vulnerable to shocks. You then have countries such as India. India at about 80% of GDP, again, that's fairly high, but the good news, the thing that gives comfort there is a lot of it is domestic debt. Nevertheless, that's, this level of debt translates into fairly high gross financing needs of about 15% of GDP. Interest payments are fairly high, about 2 to 3%, and that means you basically crowd out public investments in social sectors and building infrastructure. So this is definitely something that needs to be tackled. Nepal and Bangladesh are the two economies in the region which have more comfort. Now, let me just come very quickly to a few snapshots at a country level. So Bangladesh did quite well in 2022. They grew by 7.1%, so they were the largest major economy, fastest growing major economy in our region. But there's going to be an almost 2 percentage point decline that we're forecasting for 2023. And this is really tied to global economic conditions. If you look at the upper chart, you'll notice how exports growth, so the extreme right-hand side compares exports in this July to January period. So that's basically July of 2021 to January of 2022, and exports really boomed. You saw this 30% increase. And this was really driven by the world coming out of the pandemic, out of these lockdowns, and this surge for garments. Demand was there, and Bangladesh was able to supply it. Things have changed quite dramatically in the last 6 months, so you see a big fall in export growth rates. And it's very interesting, if you look at the lower half, this is the current account deficit. So you see a large current account deficit in 2022. You actually see a reduction being forecast for 2023. And you might be wondering, why, if exports have been doing well, I'm sorry, exports are declining, export growth is declining, why do we see this improvement in the current account deficit? And the reason is that the imports are actually showing signs of contraction in the case of Bangladesh. So fewer inputs are being imported as export growth is coming down, but the country has also put in place various import controls, and this was really a response to the events of May, June, July, when reserves started to fall. Import controls were placed in, so it's really a combination of demand factors plus these controls. So the net result is that the trade deficit is going to be shrinking, and then the other benefit that Bangladesh has is that remittances are really coming back in a big way and are expected to be important in 2023. Nevertheless, the country has embarked on these programs, and it's really these are what we call as precautionary measures that Bangladesh has taken to really tackle the current account balances and the reserve losses. The IMF program also is working with Bangladesh, looking at long-term structural issues, especially Bangladesh's vulnerability to the climate change, which, as we know, this is a country that's going to be quite vulnerable to climate shocks. Coming to India, I probably need to speed up over here. Let me just say that for India, really the big driver has been private consumption. So this has been a big driver for growth in 2023. It's going to remain a driver in 2024. And the private investment started kicking up in 2022, but we're expecting private investment to actually slow down in 2023. To balance that out, what the central government is doing is it's actually pursuing fiscal consolidation, but at the same time, it's shifting its expenditures from current items to capital. So you're seeing actually a big increase in capital expenditures by the Indian government. There's a lot that's being invested in roads, improvement of logistics. A lot of this is tied to the country's vision of Make in India, which is really the manufacturing sector. For those who might be knowing a little bit about the Indian economy, the growth in the economy has been driven by services. It's always been a big puzzle to economists globally. Why does a labor-abundant economy like India not have a better performing manufacturing sector, and especially export manufacturing? So this is the Make in India program came in about 5-6 years ago, and it tries to address this problem. A big component of which is really improvement of infrastructure, including logistics. The interesting thing, though, in the case of India, and we have a detailed discussion on this in the India chapter, is that while the central government is picking up, state governments actually are not. So India, as you know, huge economy. Each one of its states would be among, say, the largest 20 economies in the world if they were on their own. And what we see from the data is that very clearly the gap between what the states are budgeting for capital expenditures and the actual has just been going up and up over time. So this is a structural issue that in our chapter we are emphasizing as something that needs to be really addressed. But this action has to be at the state level. Pakistan, just very quickly, the economy, it grew fairly rapidly in fiscal year 2022, but then we've seen a couple of big shocks. One of this has been this unprecedented flooding, unprecedented in the history of the country. At the same time, we've seen the sort of macroeconomic difficulties actually fairly similar to what we've seen in Sri Lanka. And right now, the policy imperatives, this might seem very, very familiar from the Sri Lankan context, really are revenue mobilization, the power sector, so restoring the viability of the power sector. This is, again, a sector which has, it's not using pricing that reflects costs. So that remains a challenge. You have a lot of circular debt that goes around with these SOEs involved in the power sector. And the country also needs a more realistic exchange rate. So in other words, it's the flexibility in the exchange rate which should help you in making these adjustments. So let me get to Sri Lanka. Details are in the chapter. And the QR code is there on the agendas, but essentially just going through this very quickly. 2022, we know that GDP growth has declined very, very sharply, one of the largest reductions, if not the largest reductions we've seen in Sri Lanka's recent history at negative 7.8. 2023, again, a contraction is forecast, but it's a contraction that is far lower than what we've seen in 2022. Finally, with growth re-emerging in 2024. Very similar pattern for inflation. So 2022 is where we have the very, very high rates of inflation. They start moderating, and by 2024, we expect to see inflation rates really in much more normal territory within the target bands of monetary policy. And the big story for the next few years is the macro stabilization and structural reforms are underway. We've seen measures, clear measures and clear intent being taken by the government starting in mid to late 2022. And the key is really to continue with the reforms that have started. Just a few more slides, and I'll end. The crisis really, if you just look at these two big numbers, we can see it's set Sri Lanka back significantly. So the chart on the left is basically showing how the progress that was made to upper middle income status. In fact, the country had already achieved a level of GNI per capita in 2016 that by its own would have put the country into the upper middle income country level. But we see by 2020 with the pandemic hit, we see the country disrupted from having achieved that status. And the chart on the right-hand side shows fundamentally a very different metric of welfare, but a metric that really captures what's happening at the ground level. And what we see is Sri Lanka experienced very dramatic reductions in poverty. So it doesn't matter whether it's the extreme poverty line, the international extreme poverty line of $2.15 a day in purchasing power parity, whether it's the green line, which is essentially the poverty line that's very typical of lower middle income countries, or the red line, which is the poverty line, which is typical of upper middle income countries. Dramatic reductions, and then you see, in some cases, really a doubling. And so that gives us a sense of really where some of the focus of the program really has to be going. I'm not going to go into this more. We have our colleague from the IMF who will be talking about debt sustainability targets, but the key point is that there are 3 targets. It's on the public debt, it's on reducing annual gross financing needs, and it's really big reductions in the foreign currency debt services. And all these targets are to be met by 2032. Finally, our chapter in the Asian Development Outlook, the Sri Lanka chapter, it talks about, the final section talks about the key issues in addressing the economic crisis. So I'm not going to go into these in detail. It's over there, and I expect that a lot of the panel discussion is going to get into these issues. But essentially, you can put them into different sorts of buckets. There's a first bucket, which is the need to enhance domestic resource mobilization. And associated with that is strengthening public financial management, so things like fiscal rules, strong fiscal rules being put in, and elements from the governance side. That's one bucket. You've got this other bucket on the state-owned enterprises. We know that state-owned enterprises on the financial side, their operations have really contributed to some of the debt that we see in Sri Lanka, and we see that the operation of some of these state-owned enterprises also needs to improve. Fiscal discipline needs to improve, and once again, cost-reflective pricing needs to come in, on which, of course, I must say that the government has already started taking action in last year. Safeguarding financial sector price stability, again, very, very important issues, especially as we go forward. The final 2 points on strengthening social protection, I just, we put this in blue just to make this point that social protection is really so critical from a number of ways. It's important from a welfare perspective. We've just seen those slides on poverty, but it's also very critical from the point of view of sustainability of these programs. Because if it's very, very likely that the lower income groups are going to be seeing, that they are seeing the big hits to their standards of living, and so protecting them becomes extremely essential. Again, from a welfare perspective, but even from a sustainability of the program perspective. Final point is just fostering private sector development. Now, this is not something, this is one of those really enduring things, and I want to just end with these 2 charts. This will be familiar to the experts, but essentially the pathway back to UMIC, and it's interesting that actually Sri Lanka made its way to the UMIC status while in fact going a bit in reverse. So what you notice is that if you were to compare, the early 2000s with, let's say, this period 2007 to 2021, you find that Sri Lanka's average trade as a share of GDP actually declined, and this is really in contrast to its various comparators, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's India, and certainly whether it's Vietnam, which is an economy which has really done a stellar job into linking up with international trade generally, and specifically in global value chains. And the global value chains part is the chart on the right. Now, the key thing here is once again this reduction that we're seeing in Sri Lanka's global value chain participation. Now, you may wonder, what's this distinction between trade and global value chains? And really the distinction is I can trade by producing this remote control and just selling it to final consumers in the US. and that's trade. But what we have seen in the international global trading environment is that over the last 20, 30 years, we see a lot of trade where products are exported not for final consumption directly. You actually make a part of this control, remote control, it goes to Malaysia for processing, it might come back again to Sri Lanka, and then it goes to China for further processing, and then maybe it goes to Japan for final consumption. And what's interesting, you may wonder, well, so what? But the reason it matters is that kind of trade is very centered on actually improving the productive efficiency of your firms. That type of trade is where you see a lot of learning going on, because you're part of this production process where buyers are telling you, look, when I say buyers, I mean the immediate buyers of your components. They're telling you, look, this is the kind of product that's really going to be big. This is how you make it. This is how you manage its production. And this is really where I would say the biggest benefits of globalization come in. It's this transfer of technology and technical capacity and ultimately productivity. And so this is something where we see reductions taking place. Now, in the chapter, once again, we do talk a little bit about what are some of the specifics over here. And some of the specifics, we have the good fortune that actually prior to the pandemic, we have seen some very good studies completed for Sri Lanka. There were various growth diagnostics. There was several done by different agencies. The various multilateral development institutions did it. In fact, my colleague Utsav led the one on India. And these have really identified the constraints, the regulatory constraints, the constraints that are applying from the trade policy side. And so we know that some of the things that have to be done are bringing down protection rates. Tariff rates in Sri Lanka need to be brought down. They need to be harmonized. Issues such as paratariffs need to be dealt with. So it's an agenda which has started. I'll just end on one point, which is at the same time that we're doing these things on the trade and investment side, the issue of industrial zones and SME clusters is something really worth looking at. Because as you know, one of these country diagnostics that was done for Sri Lanka puts it, it's very difficult to do everything all at the same time. So that's it's this Oscar-winning movie of a similar title. But the reality is, it's while you do the big policy stuff, it's also a good idea to look at some of these zones that we have and how to make sure that they work better. And what these zones do, I think, is there are two constraints that we see operating on businesses in Sri Lanka pre-pandemic. One of them has to do with land. We know that a lot of the land is owned by the government. The industrial zones are an approach where you can take this land and improve the access of the private sector to land. And the second element is coordination. When I was talking about global value chains, you'll remember I was emphasizing this issue of about how factories are interlinked. It's really coordination between the private sector on markets, on management, on technology. And these kinds of things require really a lot of coordination. They also require hand-holding. We've actually seen this from the case of other parts of South Asia. In India, ADB is involved in a big way working with the government on industrial parks. If you just set aside some land and say, okay, here's an industrial park, you really may not see much private investment coming in. So one thing that's happening in Indian states is concierge systems are coming in. And basically what this is doing is it's basically telling the private sector person that, look, you're coming in, we're going to handhold you to walk you through the various regulatory aspects that constitute our business climate. And so I think that's again something that becomes relatively easy to do at the industrial zone level. So how these are managed is very important, and you can start applying the same principles actually to SME clusters. So I'm going to stop over there. I'm sorry I probably have taken a bit of too much time. I had planned to just end on regional solutions for South Asia. I'm just going to cover the first one, which is I've been talking about this in detail for Sri Lanka, but it's really, like I said right at the outset, it's an issue for South Asia as a whole. And diversifying the economic base and building competitiveness, critically important for the entire region. The specific flavor of this change is, Bangladesh, for example, has done it in garments, but Bangladesh has had a more difficult time diversifying from garments to footwear. So in one way or the other, this issue is there for the entire region. And the last bullet was on regional cooperation and investment. And in fact, I can just bring that up. When we look at the region, one of the things that's a bit disconcerting is it's the least integrated region in the world. So if you compare South Asia with ASEAN, if you compare South Asia with EU, you compare South Asia with various groupings in Latin America, et cetera, you will find it's the region which trades the least with itself. Now, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that it made us realize that these global supply chains, we should also start thinking in terms of regional supply chains. And we're hopeful that as India in particular starts this Make in India campaign and it starts to get in gear, we're actually going to see opportunities for our neighboring countries, including Sri Lanka. So with that hopeful note, let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, gentlemen, for that insightful presentation and also for remaining on stage, because now we will be going for a brief Q&A session. And you may post your questions on our digital platform. So remind you again, there will be a QR code on your tables, which will enable you to access this digital form. For virtual participants, there will be a link that will be posted on the chat. So in order to moderate this session, let me invite Mr. Shamindra Kulumanage, co-founder of Echelon Media, publishers of Echelon and econominext.com. And along with this, let me also announce that the ADO Outlook publication is now available for you to peruse online. So you may access this publication through the QR code that is on the flyer that you may have received at the entrance. This is not to confuse you with the QR code to access the digital form. This is what it will look like. So this will enable you to access the publication. For virtual participants, the link will be posted on the chat. And with that, let me hand it over to Shamindra.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Irfan and Rana. That was a great synopsis of what Asia looks like, or what the outlook for Asia looks like, and also South Asia with particular references to countries. Let's do a quick discussion, and I hope the participants or the attendees out there will also pose some questions. Can I start with you, Irfan, and what struck me most about the potential for a China recovery? Make what you will of Chinese statistics, but you can't ignore subway ridership. I think 23 cities, subway ridership is now higher than it was pre-pandemic, you said. I'm sure as you do your forecasts, you would want to err on the side of caution, right? But assume for a minute that China posts a faster than anticipated recovery. What will that mean for the rest of Asia in terms of demand, greater tourism, and also the pressures it may bring on commodity prices? What do you think are the likely outcomes of a faster than forecast Chinese recovery?
Thank you very much for that question. So this was something that came up quite a bit when we were writing the report in terms of, what if, so we have a conservative estimate close to what the government has for 5%. So something that came up is, okay, what would happen if China were to go faster than this number? So we did some further analysis on this topic. So we assumed if China, instead of growing by 5%, grew by 6%, what would be the growth outlook then? And quantitatively speaking, we found that it would raise the region's growth by 0.3 percentage points. And this is due to the linkages I mentioned earlier. So this is the increase in trade, increase in tourism that will affect, of course, global, that will raise global prospects, but in particular, China is very well integrated in regional value chains as well. So through those linkages, it should raise prospects. But on the downside, of course, commodity pressures, if ever, were to be realized, so if ever Brent prices were to react too much, although in the baseline we don't find in our analysis for them to go above by too much as what we have in our baseline. So the pressures on commodity prices perhaps wouldn't be as large, or the inflationary consequences wouldn't be as large. I think growth-wise, it would add more to the region's prospects than the downside of inflation. So maybe I'll stop here. Thanks.
Rana, if I can come to you, you talked about the region, you talked about the Indian and Bangladeshi growth stories also. Bangladesh's foreign reserves are still, I think, at a comfortable level, but that is in the context of still the central bank, I think this year having sold down about $10 billion on top of over $7 billion it has sold last year. Do you think these are early warning signs of a likely weak growth scenario in Bangladesh?
So yes, and that's why in 2023, if you look at our numbers, we are anticipating about almost a 2 percentage point decline. Now, what I would say though is that the authorities were extremely prudent. They took action fast, and I think in some way this is a sort of being able to see what was happening, what was playing out in the region. And I think one of the lessons that policymakers in Bangladesh and elsewhere were really looking into was what was happening in Sri Lanka prior. And this is where Bangladesh felt it needs to act decisively, it needs to act very fast. We have our IMF colleague in the audience, and she would know this much better than me, but the exchange rate, so some of the things that they've been working on and they've recognized is the way they set monetary policy, the way they set exchange rate policy. These things need to be looked at. So while they have introduced these import controls temporarily, these are meant to be temporary. And so they're really re-looking at how they do these things. So I think they have taken the lessons, and they are in the process of implementing this.
Staying on that theme, and if you can compare and contrast, I mean, you talked about Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, and of course Sri Lanka. If you compare and contrast post-pandemic, what those economies are potentially doing better than Sri Lanka, or what are the opportunities compared to what you see is happening in the region when Sri Lanka is looking at its potential growth story?
So let me compare Bangladesh, and maybe on the Pakistan case, I'll invite Irfan. In Bangladesh, really, it actually predates, again, the pandemic. The Bangladesh growth story, garments plays a very, very important role. And this is a sector which the country seized on early, and it really developed the capabilities to manufacture garments. Of course, it has been, it's benefited to some extent from the fact that it gets some concessions on the tariff front by lieu of its being a LDC. But we see other countries in the region that did not. For example, Nepal. Now, Nepal, of course, it's a landlocked country. It has difficulties accessing ports. But that aside, I think the big difference that I see is that Bangladesh really understood the importance of engaging in the global trading environment. And this has had a lot of knock-on positive effects. If you look at the number of young female employment that went up, that was fairly dramatic, employed in garments. That has knock-on effects on things like fertility rates. It delays in marriage age. These actually then allow more investments in children. So you have these massive knock-on effects, and so that to me is really the big difference when it comes to Bangladesh. The other thing I should mention, sorry, Irfan, is on the debt side. Bangladesh's debt profile, as you may recall from the charts, is just simply not up there. The public debt to GDP ratios are simply not up there. The exposure to external debt is not so much. It's much less. It's a lot of it is to it's more bilateral, multilateral. So there are, of course, differences on the profile of the debt that are important too.
Yeah, just to add on, Bangladesh's debt is about 15% to GDP, and it went up to 17%. And as Rana mentioned, it's mostly concessionary. So so Pakistan's story is very different from Bangladesh. So in Pakistan, we actually expect growth to slow down from 6% last year to 0.6% this year, and pending reforms that they're supposed to undertake, structural reforms, it would pick up to 2% next year. So that's our forecast. So in terms of Pakistan's growth rate, I think it was affected largely by floods last year. So the climate change angle that I spoke about in my presentation as a risk truly was realized in Pakistan's case, which affected its cotton output, which then fed into, well, the agriculture side, but then also affected its industry. But also the macroeconomic stabilization program that they've undertaken in terms of rationalizing fuel prices, gas prices, electricity prices, has had an impact on inflation, as well as on policy tightening, which has then contributed to the slowdown in economic activity. So I think the parallels with Sri Lanka are sort of far greater there than in Bangladesh's case.
If I can come to you, Rana, again, I mean, India, you painted the picture of how rapidly India is now going towards an industrialization drive after having grown on services for so long. You know, and potentially you alluded to this, but if you sort of refocus on it, what potentially can Sri Lanka learn from what India is now doing? India is going on this industrialization, right? Sri Lanka doesn't have necessarily the large labor force that India has. But if you look at lessons we can learn, what would they be?
Okay, so just two things. First, I just want to emphasize this point that while I did talk about manufacturing in the context of India, you have to remember that I'm making that point given the fact that the country had such a remarkable boom in services, and so in a sense, the lack of labor-intensive manufacturing in particular was very odd. And it is why I would say India's growth did not translate into the types of poverty reductions that you would have seen had labor-intensive manufacturing gone up. So I do want to make that point, and that's always important for any labor-abundant country to keep in mind. That's point number one. The second point is, the way the world is moving, I think we do have to recognize that you simply cannot put your eggs into any one particular basket. You know, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the period of that rapid growth, the East Asian miracle story that we came to recognize in the 1990s is a story that starts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but the world is changing, and in particular technological change. And that means you have challenges, but you also have opportunities. And I think this distinction between manufacturing and services probably starts to blur. So I would just be careful about that. And I would say, look, you walk, you run on two legs. Don't go for just manufacturing or services. Don't count out both. And the fact that Sri Lanka is a small economy, it's okay. It's a small open economy. We've seen small economies do very well in the global trading environment. Sri Lanka's position vis-a-vis its ports, its location in the Indian Ocean, and the skill levels of its people, I think are very high. And so the country is very well equipped. Whether it's more advanced types of manufacturing, whether it's services, there's absolutely no reason why in the medium term Sri Lanka should not be looking into these things. A final point is digitization. Again, brings a lot of good opportunities, and having those basic skills firmly rooted in this, in the labor force is really an advantage. All things that need to be seized upon.
One final question.
Yeah, if I can just add sort of the prerequisites are also sound macro policy, something that the Honorable Governor also mentioned. So, having prudent fiscal policy, having prudent monetary policy, market-based exchange rates. So these are sort of foundations to attract, FDI and having a stable business environment. So I agree with everything Rana has said, but, also an important ingredient, just to add to what he said, was the stability of macro policy, which is very important prerequisite.
And we'll just, I'll pose one quick question to you, Irfan, as we close this, and that is about the financial sector in the South Asian region. Sri Lanka's financial sector faces some unique challenges stemming out of the economic weakness and also the sovereign debt crisis. If you look at the region, and some countries in the region face similar challenges, how are their financial sectors, how are their banks placed to deal with these?
That's a great question. And that's something we don't really look at in the report very carefully, and we should. So maybe Rana can talk about Sri Lanka, but perhaps on the regional angle, the region's very varied, right? So you have countries that have, like Rana also mentioned, East Asian economies, as ASEAN economies that have very strong sort of macro foundations. That the lessons that they learned from the Asian financial crisis, for example, so they went ahead, they had these strong foundations, the strong macro fundamentals, but also the regulatory aspect was greatly strengthened after those experiences. So I think those are the sort of key lessons for countries that are otherwise facing difficulties on the financing angle. But maybe more specific to South Asia, Rana, I don't know whether you want to add anything.
No, I think we know that financial stability at the end of the day is, at the end of the day, financial stability is always critical. Whether you're trying to stabilize the macroeconomy or whether you're just trying, you're in normal times. We've seen this in India in the case of non-performing loans. Ultimately, it was, in India's case, a combination of regulation and then some recapitalizations, mergers of various financial institutions, which has led to the picture. In fact, I didn't get a chance to mention, but in my India slides, one of the things, the top slide really was the non-performing loans and how it's come down. And definitely, when non-performing loans were high, you didn't have firms, you didn't have the banking sector able to lend, and that was unfortunate because capacity utilization rates in firms had gone up. They were willing to, they wanted to borrow, but you had a banking sector that was in a crisis. So I mean, I think there's no doubt that the financial sector is one. I think on the positive side, there are just so many lessons that we have on how to preserve financial stability even during difficult times. It's important to take those lessons and put them in place. I know that during the discussion, these are some of the things that we're going to be touching on, so not to preempt that discussion. But I think what we've seen, the discussion on the crisis management side, the plans that are being put in, and just looking at different eventualities and planning for that and communicating that is something that really helps in ensuring that financial stability.
With that, we'll wrap this quick discussion up. Irfan, Rana, thank you. Thank you for sharing those views about the outlook for Asia, and thank you for joining this discussion.
Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you, gentlemen, for presenting the ADB's outlook for 2023 for the Asia and Pacific, as well as the informative discussion. May I also request Shamindra to kindly remain on stage? And with that, we move on to our panel discussion on Sri Lanka's current economic challenges and the way forward. And for the panel, let me invite on stage Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, Secretary to the Treasury, Ms. Aruni Gunathilaka, Chairperson of Hatton National Bank, and Mr. Utsav Kumar, Deputy Country Director and Head of Economics Unit of Sri Lanka Resident Mission of ADB. And joining us virtually from New York is Ms. Shamini Kure, member of the Presidential Advisory Group on Multilateral Engagement and Debt Sustainability and a former department director of the IMF. Ladies and gentlemen, let me once again remind you to present your questions on our digital form. In order to access this digital form for the in-person participants, you may use the QR code that's on your tables. And for virtual participants, you may access the digital form through using the link that is right now posted on the chat. Thank you. Over to you, Chandra.
All right, thank you, and good morning to the panel, and thank you for joining us. This discussion is also interactive, we hope. I hope you'll take the time to scan that QR code on your table and post some questions. There's a process by which I can see those questions, and we'd really love to have some participation. Let me start fairly broadly the discussion. Mrs. Sirivardhana, you certainly have a difficult balancing act to play in the current context. If you sort of approach this very broadly and look at what the priorities of the Treasury are in the current context, given that we've just secured board-level support for an IMF program, and Sri Lanka has announced at least some structural reforms that have been that have been discussed for many years, but now seem to be gathering steam. From your vantage point, what do you think the priorities are?
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, I think I should take this opportunity to thank ADB for the strong support that they gave during the very difficult times, especially during last 1 year period. I think Chen knows it very, very well, how difficult it was. In fact, I'm very pleased to see that now we have come to this long, and we are having some, relief during this period. But still, if I were to, answer your question, what's the, most challenging situation when it comes to treasury management? Definitely, what has come to my mind is the cash flow management. It's a very difficult, very tedious process. Due to various reasons, you know that revenue side was not performing well, and expenditure side also there were a lot of areas that warranted strong measures, but due to various reasons, it had not been the case. If we just go back to last year, when we started at the Treasury, the revenue was very low due to various reasons. In fact, some are historical reasons, some are due to some of the missteps that we took. But there was a strong need to introduce corrective measures. And from the expenditure side, it's the same. But we have passed now 1 year from there onwards. If you take today's situation, I have seen some improvements, but still there is a strong challenge remaining to the Treasury. So why I mention the cash flow management is the very difficult question, or the situation that we are facing, is that everything depends on that. So we have to ensure that system works very well. If you allow the systems to collapse, that would be the end. When it comes to government cash flow, it's much more important that you have to ensure that government's actions or activities are being continued. So if you see the revenue that we are getting, it's not sufficient. In fact, I have mentioned this at various forums as well. It's not sufficient to meet the mandatory day-to-day expenditures. If you take the average revenue that we are getting of around 160, 170 billion per month, but we have to pay about 93 billion or 94 billion for the salaries, and about 29 billion for the pensions, and about 9 billion to health services, basically to purchase the medicine, and then around 6 to 7 billion to the other social welfare related activities. So that's a very, very difficult situation, because if you are basically considering the amount that left with you, it's a very small amount, but you have to do all the other things. You have to pay the interest. You have to make debt service, domestic, foreign. Even though we say that under interim policy we have stopped the debt payment, it's not. We are continuously paying the debt service to the international financial institutions, World Bank, ADB. So all those things have to be there. So managing that would be the most difficult task. Of course, we are doing that on a day-to-day basis. But while maintaining the cash flow, we have taken a lot of measures. That's where all these new measures, like the revenue improvement measures, expenditure rationalization measures, would come into play. So while managing this difficult situation, we are very closely working and very strongly taking measures to, in fact, we can go on discussing this, but I would say that would be the most important challenge for us, Treasury.
That's very clear in terms of a priority, Mr. Sirivardhana. So if you will indulge me one follow-up to that, the IMF program, which is now in force, is also a little unconventional from those of the past, because there is the ability to get fiscal support. It is that money is not going to lie with the central bank purely. There is also, it's been mentioned several times over and over again that Sri Lanka's multilateral supporters like the ADB will also give budgetary support. I'm sure you're looking at, okay, how 2023 is going to play out now that you've got the IMF to commit to Sri Lanka. An agreement is there with the IMF, and the potential of more multilateral support for the fiscal side, for the budget. How's the outlook like? Surely you've had a very difficult year, but what's the outlook like?
In fact, even though 2022 was a very difficult year, I can give some numbers. For example, one of the key agreement or commitment under the IMF program is, from the Treasury side, is to maintain a primary balance at a desired level. So the target was to maintain it around 4% of GDP, but we achieved it as 3.8%. So we have kind of overperformed that, in the sense that it includes about 1% of GDP loans that we on-lent to CPC during this difficult period, about $700 million. But due to various reasons, CPC was not able to pay it back to the Treasury. So now we have the responsibility to make that. So if you basically remove that, the primary balance was around 2.8%. So you can imagine, if you basically keep the interest payments aside, we have made a very strong commitment, and also we have taken strong measures to reduce the non-interest component of the expenditure component of the budget. That's the outlook or the outcome that we have achieved. But this year also, we have a strong commitment to achieve around 0.7% of deficit in the primary balance. So far, we have been able to maintain, expenditure on track. And as a result of the strong measures, particularly from the expenditure side that we introduced last year, we have been able to reduce the expenditure. So that will continue this year as well, and years to come. So that is going to be one of the key areas that we will be implemented to achieve these fiscal targets. In fact, I am not going to discuss anything about the revenue side here because it has been discussed widely. But it is also giving very strong support for us in this endeavor. So we are very hopeful that with the support that we are getting from both the revenue and expenditure side, we would be able to meet the commitment under the IMF program. And in addition to that, we would be coming up with a lot of other legal changes. For example, we'll be coming up with a public financial management bill, which would, in fact, previously there was a mention about fiscal rules, strong fiscal rules. In fact, we would be incorporating very strong fiscal rules into this new act, which is going to come as a public financial management bill. So that would be kind of a binding thing, and we are right now discussing, in fact, there was a recent mission from the IMF as well, we are very strongly discussing how best we should incorporate this into the law. So that would be kind of a binding condition, at least going forward. So with all this support that is coming in, we are very certain that we would be able to achieve that. And the most important part that I have been emphasizing within the Treasury and also the outside the Treasury, particularly to the political authorities, why we are here, because we have not maintained the discipline in fiscal management in the past. So we want to ensure that fiscal discipline is maintained, and it has to be maintained at every level, from the top to bottom. So that is must, according to my understanding, and that's the recommendation that I have been giving to the government, and that has, in fact, embedded in the IMF program as well. So that's why I very strongly believe that delivering these IMF targets would entail ensuring the fiscal discipline within the country, which has not been the case in the past. Thank you.
Utsav, may I bring you in? Can you talk to us, Utsav, about the ADB's prognosis for Sri Lanka's economy this year, and when will we see growth emerge? Talk to us about this year and next year, that is 23 and 24. And what do you think will be the primary drivers of growth when we do start to see growth?
Yeah, in fact, in a way it was sad to see that chart that you showed. Only Sri Lanka had, maintained a negative growth in the South Asian countries that you showed. And it's going to be the case in this year as well, even though with the 3% lower contraction compared to 7.8 contraction that we experienced last year. Only 2024 we would be having this 1.4% growth, as you showed. I kind of broadly agree with their outlook and the analysis. But getting back into the growth is the overarching objective of all these policies. First, to ensure the macro stability, and then gradually work with other areas, especially the required structural adjustment process. And that will be kind of, be the kind of supporting, aspect in order to achieve this goal. And as we saw, there are some, low-hanging fruits as well. For example, tourism, which is already, seeing positive developments, and we want to basically continue with that. And at the same time, the agriculture. In fact, I just saw in the newspapers today, or maybe yesterday, there's been about 50% drop in the agricultural output last year, especially paddy production, as a result of this, fertilizer policy. So now, one of the priorities that we gave as the government, as the Treasury, is to ensure that first fertilizer is submitted and provided, so that the agriculture would, start the growth process. In fact, thanks to the ADB, World Bank, USAID, and all the other, development partners who were with us in that endeavor, we were able to, provide, maybe not at the desired levels, but we were able to, provide sufficient amount of fertilizer to the agriculture. So the growth in the agriculture would be contributing, and as well as the services sector. But only issue is that, industry sector, because there are still, some of the import limitations, we may have to continue to a certain period of time, although there will be some pacing out of these import restrictions. So first, my idea is to to get the support of this low-hanging fruit, and also some of the development that I'm already seeing, and then go to the next year and at least try to get the positive growth that we are eagerly waiting next year.
Thank you for that, Mr. Siravardhana. Can I come to you and ask you about the ADB's prognosis for the Sri Lankan economy 2023 and 2024, and when growth does emerge, it will hopefully emerge this year, what will those factors driving the growth be, you think?
Thanks, Shamindra, for the question. So first of all, let me begin by commending the country's leadership and President Wickremesinghe for steering this economy through the last 1 year, containing the crisis and ultimately, reaching the staff level agreement and then the board approval, as well as now setting forth a clear vision and in terms of addressing the root causes of the crisis. As we saw in the presentation by my colleagues, the reality is Sri Lanka is facing an unprecedented crisis, a crisis that will take some time to resolve. We are looking at 2 back-to-back years of contraction, again, quite unprecedented in Sri Lanka's history. Rana showed some charts on how much significantly back it will set Sri Lanka compared to where it was just before the pandemic. So I think in terms of the recovery process, what we are seeing is, or what we think will happen is maybe some green shoots, if I can use that, by the end of the year, and some tapered recovery only going into 24. In terms of just to put a bit of more sectoral color to it, as the secretary was saying, since the fertilizers have started coming in, this situation in the agriculture sector hopefully will stabilize. When I say stabilize, I'm not saying coming back to where it was before 2021, but starting to improve. So that will provide some positive contribution to the growth. Industry sector, both manufacturing and construction within that. I mean, if you look at some of the early signs, early data that is coming out, this year they're already pointing towards continued weaknesses, and that is likely to continue at least through the first half of the year, and especially the demand, both domestically and globally for some of the exports is likely to be weak. Services, tourism is a bright spot in the economy. The new data was I just saw some news flashes that again March numbers have been quite well. So all in all, I think roughly the first 3 months of tourism is near about 50% of what it was for the whole year last. So I think that trend is likely to continue. Hopefully, there are no major global economic shocks that will constrain that. Domestically, it's important that stability continues to keep attracting the tourists. So tourism and tourism-linked sectors we see will continue to do well. Financial sector, real estate, I think that is where we see some muted growth, 23 and 24. So and that's sort of the picture in terms of sectorals and sort of our thinking on what's driving the contraction, as well as a tapered recovery next year. But let me also mention that a key factor behind our assumptions is continued progress on the IMF program, as well as the related milestones with it, including progress on debt restructuring negotiations, and that will keep help unlocking external financing for the country. So that's a key sort of assumption there, and that also means that the uncertainty around these forecasts are more than what we would otherwise work with. In terms of the drivers of growth beyond the 2024, earlier there was discussion with Rana on manufacturing and services. So one of the characteristics of the Sri Lanka's economy has been a relatively concentrated base of exports. 3-4 limited products, limited sources of foreign exchange, and if any of them take a hit, that impacts the external balances. But in terms of potential, and I'm sort of might sound like something that you've heard many a times, but I think it's worth sort of just going over some of these things. If we look at it sectorally, again, some of the drivers of growth are in agriculture, agribusinesses. For example, tea, of course, is one of Sri Lanka's major exports, and spices as well, and fisheries. In terms of the manufacturing sector, garments, and when we're saying garments, it's very different from the garments that we see coming out of, let's say, Bangladesh. Sri Lanka is in a very high value-added segment, whether it be with Nike or whether it be with Victoria's Secret, right? So, there is a key distinction there for Sri Lanka in terms of where it is placed in terms of the value chain. Likewise, there are some factories which are producing some high-tech electronic components as well. Then the other potential is in terms of the extractive industries, the gems, and the IT and the IT-enabled services. And of course, finally, last but not the least, tourism. Now, many of you would say, we've heard this before, so what's different? So I'd like to just emphasize one thing here is the importance of the policy environment, addressing the policy constraint, ensuring macroeconomic stabilization, the investment climate, harmonizing the trade and the investment policies. I think those are going to be very, very crucial, especially now to come out of this crisis, to put in place the foundations for sustained growth so that it goes beyond the 1.5–2% that we are looking at in the near term. I'll pause here. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Kure, hello. We can see you in a screen out here in front of us, so we'll speak to the screen if you don't mind. As I bring you in, Dr. Kure, the Sri Lankan government has implemented some difficult changes for people. Amongst them, the cost-reflective price on petroleum products and electricity, etc. And there are some more hard reforms to come that are likely to impact ordinary people. What must the government get right when implementing these measures, given the fact that, there is a sense of exhaustion among people about the impact of this crisis that they've had to face?
Thank you. Yeah, look, there are many things the government has to get right. One of the things I think, well, the debt restructuring is very important. We have to get that part right. It's not just getting the IMF program, but we have to get a good restructuring deal done and get it done fast. So that's just a precondition. I mean, we have to do that. After that, I mean, in terms of getting public support, I think you have to, one of the things that are very important is to communicate effectively. I mean, I think that although there's a lot of sort of discussion within, if I can say, the educated English-speaking elite, there isn't really a whole lot of explanation given in Sinhalese, in Tamil, explaining to people why these reforms are needed, what are the reforms, and there are very important things in the program, like the strengthening the fiscal institutions. There is a whole host of commitments there. People are complaining about the taxes, but to be frank, it is a progressive tax system, and most of the people complaining are I mean, we're talking about earning $100,000 rupees or more. The average wage is between 30–40,000. So, they're earning more than double the wage. So you have to get the broader population to understand that the tax system is actually being made more fair. They may not feel very rich at 100,000 rupees, but it is essential because the subsidies and everything we have been given in fuel, in electricity, actually favors the people who consume those products. And because the better off people consume more electricity, consume more fuel, they are the main beneficiaries of those cheap prices. They have to understand there are people who consume very little of this, and they are very poor. And so that part of the communication, explaining again and again and again in the language, beyond the English-speaking community is important. So I think communication is critical. The other thing is to be transparent. Everything has to be done in a very transparent way. People have lost trust. It's not just this government. I'm just saying with all politicians. And I think it's very important that so there are three areas where I think transparency is particularly important. One is on reforming and privatizing the state enterprises. When that is done, that has to be done in a way that is extremely clear to people, that we are adhering to international standards, that these things are not being, sold off, and there will be the rumor mongering, the lack of trust. So the government has to show that it's going through a open process as it goes through reforming and privatizing these state-owned enterprises, which it has to do. I mean, the government sector is just simply too big, and you cannot continue these subsidies. Everybody understands it, but so it's important to be transparent. The other thing is publishing key information. I think the tax information there's far more information needs to be available to the public. Look, what kinds of taxes are being collected in which kinds of personal and corporate income tax, who are the corporations that are benefiting, what is from tax exemptions, tax holidays. We need to be clear. We're asking a lot of people. So it's only fair that we kind of publish this information. There are commitments, by the way, in the program to be more transparent on the tax side. And also, I think on the public borrowing and spending, there has to be more, what is the public money being spent on? Why is this a priority? And people need to understand this. I mean, if you ask, how much does the government pay to keep Sri Lankan Airways afloat? I mean, that's a big, if you compare that amount and how much you're spending on health, people will be shocked. So because the numbers that go for these kinds of subsidies are large. So that kind of transparency is important. The other thing is empowering the anti-corruption agencies. We have to be very aggressive about that and track down and prosecute corruption. There are commitments in the program. As we know, there's a diagnostic happening. And there has to be some action to go with those commitments. Reforming the social safety nets, really, there is a process. Again, everything I'm mentioning, there is a process in the program, but you have to communicate and explain. But I think these are the important things that it has to get right, and to be able to truly target the bottom 20% of the population. That there is a registry now being created. There's a welfare benefits commission, a committee that's being set up to run this in a way that we are really running it not for politically connected people, but for people who are genuinely very poor and need to be protected. So the bottom line, the way I'm saying it is that if the government is going to ask the public to pay more through taxes, through cost recovery pricing, it needs to show that the money is being well used, that the institutions are strong. It's something that was mentioned before, that we need to strengthen fiscal institutions. It's not just about doing something right for 1 or 2 years, it's forever. So, that's an important thing that I think people will be popular with people, and actually then finally to protect the poor. So we have to get all these things right. And I think then there will be some buy-in to the program, and it's very important. I think again, the governor made the point that we can't go back again to the, and get this wrong, and then if we have another restructuring, it's going to be much worse than what people think they've been paying. It's going to be much worse. So, you have to explain to people what the choices are. A random thing. It's because we have no financing. It's because we've come to the end of the road. We have to do this, and they will be the beneficiaries over the long run. So if you can make this case, I think people will buy in. But like I said, it's very important that these things are explained in Sinhalese and Tamil. Right. Because the mass of the population is not getting the messages that I think the English sort of speaking community may be discussing in more detail.
Sure. Thank you, Dr.
So
Gray.
that would be my bid for that.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. Aruni, I'll bring you in. You possibly see this crisis up close, or the banks, commercial banks.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm asking Aruni a question now, right? If you can hear me. So we'll continue, Aruni. The banks possibly see this crisis up close because you are probably dealing with customers, businesses, large and small, that are impacted by the economic crisis and the lack of liquidity, etc. If Sri Lanka is to emerge into a growth path, having healthy businesses and banks that can support them will be really important. If you look at that context, what do you think are the set the stage for us. What are the challenges Sri Lanka's large banks or the financial sector in general currently face, and how do you think we should get about addressing them?
Okay, so good morning, and thank you to ADB for focusing on Sri Lanka and seeing potential in the midst of a crisis. I think, as the governor said, we won't get another opportunity. We have to get it right this time, and nobody's going to give us another chance. So let me start off. I think the financial sector has been in crisis since we've had stress and challenges since the Easter Sunday bombings. Then there was the constitutional crisis. Then there was COVID, which led to the economic crisis and sort of a foreign currency liquidity crisis. So we've seen a crisis from 2019, and I think the banks have remained resilient throughout this period. But I would say 2022 was one of the most challenging years for the financial sector. It's been very dynamic and volatile, to say the least. So what was initially a foreign currency liquidity crisis, which largely emerged as a result of the sovereign profile, international funding to banks were also shut off due to the sort of the sovereign profile. So the foreign currency liquidity and also rupee liquidity was our initial problem. Thereafter, that was sort of resolved due to the import controls. As a result, the foreign currency liquidity situation is much better now because of the inflows plus the import restrictions. But what we witnessed thereafter was a deterioration of the credit sort of cycle in our portfolios, credit quality in our portfolios as a result of the COVID moratoriums coming to an end and as a result of the economic crisis. So there were two things. One was the credit deterioration, and the other was the impairments on account of the foreign currency bond holdings of some of the larger banks. So the impairments were unprecedented on account of these two aspects in 2022. Part of this was offset due to the high interest rate margins last year due to the repricing of loans prior to repricing of deposits. As a result, we managed to sort of offset some of the impairments. There were high commission incomes, there were gains on due to foreign currency appreciation in the dollar for the banks. Therefore, we managed to offset some of that. But now, as we go into the new year, I think the deterioration of the sort of the credit deterioration has not come to an end. So we are going to see further stage 3 sort of stage impairments going up, going into stage 3 as we call it, that is our NPLs, which is around gross NPLs in the industry are around 10.9%. Which has gone up from like 4% previously. So these are the sort of, this is the critical thing we face, and then the uncertainty with regard to the domestic debt restructuring, as I'm glad Shamini said that has to be resolved fast because of that uncertainty and the impact on the balance sheet of banks. So if you look at the banks, we have about 40% of our assets in treasury bills and bonds. This is due to the private sector credit coming down. We have and deposits going up. We have sufficient liquidity, and thereafter these have to be placed in treasury bills and bonds because we are not able to lend that due to the increased interest rates. As a result, there's a huge exposure to rupee sovereign debt. So the domestic restructuring will have a quite a huge impact on the balance sheets of banks and on capital. And it is not a, it's a very costly time to raise capital. We have sort of thin capital buffers at the moment. And if this capital gets further impacted, it's not an optimal time to raise capital because ROEs of banks are single digits for a frontier market. With ROEs sort of in single digits, it's not ideal time to raise capital. Thereafter, therefore, this is going to be quite a challenge in terms of preserving capital. And as we move forward, we need to see how do we optimize capital and how do we preserve capital so that can come in the form of how do we do safe lending, what kind of lending would we do in the future. We have to focus on recoveries, and we have to also do some cost optimization.
If you had to lend to lower risk areas of the economy, and I suppose facing capital challenges, that's a choice you may have to consider. If you very quickly tell us, what does that mean? How does that sort of change your balance sheet, and what's the impact on your customers, on the economy of doing that?
So the sort of, if your capital is, what we have learned through the crisis is that capital is very scarce. It's not easy to raise capital, so the less capital you have, the less lending you can do. So some banks have already gone for debentures, etc., at a high cost. Some banks will have to, we've done a lot of stress testing of our portfolios, and we realize that we have to raise capital. We'll probably have to raise capital, or we have to reduce our balance sheets. So we have to do one of the two. As I said, we have now invested in treasury bills and bonds. Those are zero risk weighted, right? And those are liquid assets. But when we start lending, those will attract risk weights, and that's going to eat into our capital. So we have to be conscious in order to balance that. So it technically means that you can lend less, and we have to, at the same time, we are conscious that we have to lend to the segments that need it, especially the micro and the SMEs. That's where the money is needed. But as soon as you start lending to those sectors, that attracts a higher risk weight. So it's sort of a contradiction, but you have to learn to balance it through, I think we were talking about linking into global supply chain financing, working capital. So as soon as you structure financing that way, you can sort of manage your capital. So we have to think about new ways of doing things, Shamindra. And one thing is we have to think about how we can attract new sources of capital in terms of green financing, green bonds. How do we link in with DFIs? Because a lot of the private sector international parties may not have the risk appetite, right?
Sure.
So we have to try to structure
Let me quickly ask you a follow-up. I mean, let's be brief here.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate from where you are, should there not be a restructure of domestic debt that impacts the bank, that banks may see generally a shrinking of their balance sheets this year?
Should not see it.
Without a domestic debt restructure?
Without a domestic. Yeah, so I think we're talking about treasury bills because banks hold quite a significant amount of treasury bills, but most of it is held by central banks. So I think we're now talking about.
Do you think balance sheets will shrink this year?
Balance sheets have already shrunk.
Yes.
Already shrunk. I think balance sheets might shrink further because the appetite for private sector credit, we are not seeing uptick in that because of the high interest rates.
Sure.
And I don't think there's going to be huge investment with interest rates being at these levels. So I suppose it's going to be flat or very small growth may come in more than last year.
Sure. I'll ask the panel to be very brief in the next set of responses. Can I start with you, Mr. Sirivardhana? I mean, this question or this uncertainty about domestic debt restructure is still hanging in the air. There are many people who would like to have an answer to it with finality. From where you are, very briefly, is there finality now with the issue that domestic debt restructure is going to be limited to any holdings of bonds at the central bank?
Shamindra, I think this is a question that I should not be involved in at this particular moment, because we have had a meeting, the presentation, I think, of a few days ago. There we have very clearly indicated our policy. And then now we are basically working on that. And our final, policy and also the framework would be announced towards the end of this month. So that's my broader comment at this moment. And we will be basically, taking all the, aspects into account when we are basically designing, particularly the maintenance of finance system stability. As you mentioned, it's very important. So we are very concerned about that. We consciously would be looking at all those things, and we will be basically announce the policy.
Ustav, can I bring you in? We're talking about the financial system and its ability to support Sri Lanka's growth in 2023 and beyond. The ADB is readying a package potentially now that the IMF has endorsed Sri Lanka's economic strategy broadly. In that package, what are the main components of that package, and does that in any way involve supporting Sri Lanka's financial sector to be healthy?
Okay, so first, I think let me thank Aruni for explaining that very clearly in terms of how the financial sector is being impacted. So finance, I think, is the lifeblood of any economic activity, and it's important that that system doesn't choke up, and otherwise it can have a very serious effect on economic activity. So it is quite important that the financial sector remains hale and hearty. Now, in terms of ADB support post IMF program, there are several things that we are discussing with the government and the central bank on various areas to support. Financial sector stability is one of them. We know that there is a asset quality review that is underway. We will need to wait for the outcome of that to see what are the next steps from there on. But as I said, financial sector, among other sectors, for example, power sector, trade and investment, and a few others, these are some of the things that we are looking at. This will be sequenced over the medium term, so this is not everything that will be coming in 2023. But financial sector and power sector are some of our higher priority on our list.
If I can sort of ask you to explain what potentially are the options that you have in terms of financial sector. Will you be subscribing to bonds issued by the banks? Is there support that will go further towards directly supporting capital or Basel compliant bonds, for instance, which is which can be counted into capital in the banks?
So in terms of the modality, it will be sovereign support. Whether that takes the form of budgetary support or other things, we are still working on that. So too soon to say, but it will be sovereign side support. That's the first step.
Okay, so you will essentially want to be supporting a program with the sovereign that directly targets the banks.
It will take the form of a budgetary support, or possibly it can be a project modality as well, but again, too soon for me to say which form it might take at this stage.
Mr. Sirivardhan, if I can bring you in quickly, what are the mechanizations of something like that? If there are broad thoughts, and I sort of respect your view that these things are yet to be worked out. There is a lot of details that must be considered in this. But if you were looking at, if the government were wanting to support the banks for their stability, what are the options on the table?
No, that's why I previously also indicated that our prime, objective is to, maintain the government's cash flow. And then we are, as he mentioned, we are basically having all these discussions, particularly with the ADB and also the World Bank, to have some sort of, financial package that could be, taken to support if there's a need. And that's why, as mentioned, this AQR is also now being conducted. And then only we would be able to, see the vulnerabilities and also whatever the requirements going forward. So based on that, we would be basically deciding on, best way of, supporting if the necessity is there. So that would be my broad answer on that. Yeah.
Aruni, I'm sure you'll agree there's a necessity. Maybe you will agree there's a necessity from where you are as a board director and a chairperson of a large bank. What do you think, from your point of view, what form should the support take if there's fiscal support or support from the government to the banking sector?
I think it's important, as we've all saying, that the financial sector stability is maintained. I'm sure IMF and everybody's looking at what is the risk sort of tolerance of the banks, right? Everybody's doing stress tests to see what is the maximum a bank can take in terms of haircuts, etc. And what is the sort of the balance you have to maintain in order for the banks to be still well capitalized. Central Bank also has allowed us to draw down on our capital conservation buffers of 2.5% in case of need, but we have to remember that we have to be well capitalized in order to support growth. So it can't be sort of just meeting the regulatory minimum. We have to be strong enough to support the growth. So whilst we are not specifically looking at support, we are looking to all the parties concerned to ensure that banks remain stable in terms of when the haircuts, etc., are done. So, but I think with the confidence back in the country, we are quite confident that we can look to potential private placements. Rights issues might be a little more difficult. We might be able to do some debentures at a cost. But we do have our own ways of doing things as long as we can manage the sort of the impairments on the sovereign bond side.
Dr. Kure, if I can bring you in, and if you can comment on potentially what Sri Lanka's options should be with the banks, and also sort of talk to us about the negotiations broadly that are ongoing with Sri Lanka's foreign debt holders, the holders of the commercial debt Sri Lanka has issued. What sort of time frames should we be looking at for that discussion, and how soon can we access global capital markets once those discussions or once an agreement is arrived at with Sri Lanka's foreign creditors? If you can answer for us very briefly those two questions, the financial sector question, and how soon can Sri Lanka, you think, from where we are, start accessing global financial markets again?
Okay, just very quickly, what I'd say about the financial system, based on my experience at the fund, in similar situation, I worked on Korea, where the banking system had to be recapitalized. And I just want to make sure people understand that when the public sector, when the government steps in to recapitalize a bank, it has to write down the shareholders to zero. It essentially nationalizes the bank. That is how it's supposed to be done. So it's not you get a subsidy from the government. So it's not something, it's something that the IMF will start to press on us if we put public money into private banks, because it's a subsidy to the shareholders. You have to write down the shareholders and then put public money, and that's what we did in Korea. So that's a very different thing with public banks. Of course, those have to be recapitalized, but public money being used to capitalize a private bank is a big deal. So we should be aware of that. But they can be recapitalized. I was just explaining, the banks are cautious and they are looking for capital, and it's not a great time. There are other ways to support the banks rather than through capitalization, through some kinds of regulatory forbearance, maybe that are sort of closely monitored and just to temporarily get through a tough period. On the private restructurings, so one of the things is that this is all very new. This is new in this sense. at the time when the Asia crisis happened, there were no debt sustainability analyses. There were no financing assurances. None of those things existed. So it was much easier to, in a sense, move quickly. Now, it's much more complicated, and it's complicated for different, it used to be the Paris Club and the London Club, which is the private banks. Those were the main players in the past. You could strong arm the banks to keep lending to a country and kind of work out the debt. That was Korea. Now we have bondholders and we have non-Paris Club members. It's considerably more complicated because of this, and that is why it took us so long to get the financing assurances. But there are countries like Zambia that have been waiting for 2 years in this sort of limbo. We have to be very, very proactive and aggressive in coming up with proposals and putting it to the creditors so that they're not going to volunteer. We have to do this, and getting them to the table. I think the private sector, my sense is the private external creditors, the bondholders are, we're lucky in a way. They are institutional investors. They're serious. They hold on the debt for long term. They don't just sell it off. So they are willing to talk, and we should, both them and the bilateral creditors, we're going to need to get a deal very quickly. So there is no playbook. This is what I'm trying to say. We have to make it up as we go, and Sri Lanka has to come up with specific debt options, and then these guys will take a while. Everybody, there's no definition of how do you get comparability of treatment across, the different debtors. They care very much that you do not, pay off another creditor with better terms than when they took a haircut or something. So we shouldn't assume that this is going to be an easy process. It'll be very tough. And, but I think there is they're not trying to run Sri Lanka to the ground. It's not in their interest. And the reason it's not in their interest is that they want a viable country at the end of it that'll pay off, that'll increase the value of whatever is remaining, because they need to sell that off. So Sri Lanka is trading at a discount now, a steep discount. If they can, after the restructuring, the value of that bond rises, they make money. So that is how it's supposed to work. So we need to move fast, and we need to give some viable options to our different creditors and take charge of this process, because there is no standard playbook anymore.
Dr. Kurai, point taken, that you think there's still a lot more work to do before we have a deal with Sri Lanka's creditors. Should we have one sometime this year, in a couple of quarters, hopefully? Does that mean that Sri Lanka can immediately start potentially accessing global financial markets again for capital?
So I would say that it will probably help the private sector get private credit, credit, they can draw on private financing that they were perhaps been now blocked because the sovereign is blocked. When the sovereign is in question, even the private to private credit gets affected. Whether the market access for Sri Lanka, we have to ask whether at what interest rates we're going to be able to borrow. Because, we have a DSA in which there are constraints on how much we can get into new debt. Now, market access, that depends on how well and how cooperatively we treat our external bondholders. And I don't think that and also a lot will depend on how well we perform under the program. As the governor was saying, we have to do it perfectly. We can't be just dilly-dallying and kind of, doing our usual, half-hearted reforms. We have to really do the hard stuff. They're watching us. The institutional reforms, the structural reforms, those are important. And if they feel like, oh, well, this is a good risk, they'll be willing to come back in, and they will be willing to give us the kind of interest rates that we can afford to pay. Because As long as we're a high-risk country, they won't do that. So I think that is up to us, both in terms of getting a good, a fair restructuring, one that leaves them also feeling like we're a serious country. We're not trying to, make things difficult in the sense of asking for too much, but at the same time getting a good deal that makes us viable, but at the same time also implementing the fund supported program. So we got to do all of these things, and then yes, there's a possibility.
Thank you, Dr. Kuray. Can I come to you, Steph, and I'm going to audience questions here. You talked about economic governance broadly as one principle that may underpin ADB support for Sri Lanka coming out of this crisis. Can you talk to us about what that means? How would the ADB want to see corruption vulnerabilities addressed, and how would it want governance to be strengthened as part of such support?
Thanks for the question. So Shamindra, first, governance component is a key part of the IMF program, and I think improving governance will be very, very important to improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of public expenditure. So what is ADB doing in regards to that? First is at a project level, good governance is embedded and is embedded in our in all our projects in terms of our due diligence process, looking at various anti-corruption and integrity measures. So that's a key part of our support. Second is we've been working with SLAS-MB on improving the accounting and the auditing standards. Third is we are working with the Central Bank Financial Intelligence Unit on providing support for AML and CFT measures, anti-money laundering and combating of financing for terrorism. So broadly, these are some of the areas that we are supporting. Now, as we prepare our next phase of support, we will continue to work with the government and development partners to see which are the areas that we can further provide support on. Again, specifics on this, it's a bit too soon to say, but some of the areas that we've been working on in terms of governance I've already shared. Thank you.
Mrs. Sirinathhan, if I can bring you in, you talked about the challenge you face with cash flow management, and there's a question here about the revenue, how it's performing now that there have been significant adjustments to taxation. Is the trend in revenue meeting expectations or exceeding expectations on the budget, of the budget?
Yeah, last year we saw a considerable, in fact, significant increase. It's around maybe 38% increase of the revenue. But nominal GDP was also very high last year. So as a percent of GDP, we didn't see a significant increase in 2022. But this year we have seen considerable improvement, particularly from the indirect taxes like value-added tax. And first 3 months, there has been a kind of encouraging increase. But the problem is whether we would be able to meet the annual targets. I think that's the broader question that they're asking. So that, in fact, depends not only on this policy and inflation impact, but the improvement of the tax administration. That's why we have given the much more importance to broaden the tax base and get many people into the tax net, and also to improve the IT-based systems in the Inland Department, particularly the RAMIS. There has been a lot of issues in the RAMIS system in the past, maybe 6-7 years. But now, all of a sudden, we have to implement all these reforms at once. So while we are basically providing this policy support, and we are basically giving very strong follow-up to implement all this. So with all these things coming in, we are hopeful that we would be able to increase the revenue. But so far, on the specific question, we have seen encouraging development in the revenue side.
Can I bring you in, Ustav? You talked about two aspects about that you may want to address in a ADB program. You mentioned at least two aspects of it, addressing the vulnerabilities in the financial sector and also the utilities, the CEB in particular. For instance, I think in Sri Lanka, we've been talking about unbundling the CEB for 25 years at least. Can you outline for us what you have in mind or what the ADB would like to see in terms of reforms in these, as far as the CEB is concerned?
So in terms of CEB, we've been working with CEB for for several years in this sector, in the energy sector as well. In terms of some of the areas that we are looking at reforms, I think the one that you mentioned, unbundling, is one of them. Second is, again, continue to work on the cost-effective pricing as well. And third that we are looking at is improving the renewable energy space and developing a renewable energy roadmap. So those are the three broad areas that we are looking at. Again, as we keep engaging with CEB to see what are the needs, and we're happy to sort of engage with them further in case there are other areas that we need to provide support on. But to begin with, these are the three areas that we are looking at.
Any quick questions from the audience? This is your last chance to pose any questions you have for the panel. I'm not sure we can take questions from the floor, so can we? Okay, we'll take no, okay. I'm sorry. You'll have to put it on the platform. Please scan that code for last questions. Aruni, there's a question here for you about where you see loan, where would you expect loan demand to come from in 23 and 24, and what levels of NPLs would you anticipate in 23 and 24, broadly for the sector, not for the bank you're representing? If you talk in terms of stage 2 and 3 NPLs, I mean, in IFRS 9, you classify loans, I think, depending on the risk, so maybe stage 2 and 3.
In terms of credit growth, I think as the interest rates come down, we expect the private sector credit demand to sort of take off more than last year. And that's where we primarily, most banks have the appetite. It's regard to the private sector. I think the public sector, as was discussed, investment from the public sector is going to go down drastically. So private sector would have to come in there. And in terms of NPLs, as I told you, because of the inflation, tax hikes, disposable incomes coming down, we still see the credit cycle deteriorating. And certain sectors like construction, whether it's even renewable energy because of the CEB payments not coming in. So there are certain sectors which have been our development has been highly dependent on the public sector. So all that business is going to get severely impacted. So certain industries, but as we spoke about, agri, tourism, etc., should sort of take off. So there should be a balance, but I think right now the stage 2 and 3, as you said, I think we were speaking there, around 25-30%. If you take stage 2 and 3, if you take 3-year loan, is about 11%. But we have to stop the stage 2 moving to 3. But the stage 2 bucket is really increasing. So it's a matter of how do we help businesses revive. All banks have separate units trying to get businesses to help them revive, give them further moratorium. So I think this can be managed. I don't see a significant uptick in NPLs. I think we should be able to manage it along these sort of at these levels.
All right, I will wrap the session up now, but I will ask each panelist to take no more than a minute. Any final thoughts? Please take no more than a minute. Dr. Kure, can I start with you? 1 minute.
Just to say that I think we are at a very critical crossroads right now, and we need to, I think it's important for the government to get public support, and we need to get that restructuring done quickly. I'm more optimistic that growth will come back quickly, because the thing that is really holding it back is the uncertainty and the import constraints, right? So we have to improve the foreign exchange situation to a point where these import restrictions can be removed. I think getting those two things done would significantly help the economy grow. So I don't think we are condemned to -3 with all due respect to the ADB's forecast. I think that is up to us. So we should commit ourselves to implementing the program and getting that restructuring, and I think we will grow.
Ustav, can I come to you next? Take a minute at most.
So I'll just highlight 5 things. So first is, as we mentioned in the beginning, it's a very, very deep crisis. So I think the need for a social safety net and protecting the poor is utmost in this situation. And so that's the first most important thing. Second is reforms, as we see from around the world, especially deep reforms, tend to be unpopular, attract resistance, and it's important to communicate the why, what, and the how of the reform. So a unified sort of a communication strategy is going to be quite important. Third is, as Shamini mentioned earlier, transparency, especially when it comes to SOEs. Fourth is to stay the course. As we've heard from the governor and from Shamini, it is important to get this right, and there are ample examples of repeated defaults around the globe. So it is quite important to avoid that. And by staying the course, and which is my final point, is many times I hear it's a 4-year program, but what I would like to emphasize is when I say stay the course, it's not about staying the course for the duration of the program. It is about staying the course even after the program, so that the policies are sustained and they continue. Otherwise, again, there are risks of falling back and losing the gains that have been made. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I think economic stabilization, as Shamini says, it's up to us how soon it comes, but we have to understand what was the crisis about, right? There are lessons learned from it. The growth has to come from the private sector. We have to try to mobilize local markets, capital markets, and how do we do that? We have to think about new funding sources, so we can't still go on the borrowing mode. We have to think of how do we mobilize local currency funding through local markets. How do we get at new financing structures? How do we get DFIs in? How do we get climate? There are so many ESG funds and climate funds out there. How do we structure finance? How do banks partner with these funds to mobilize other private sector investors locally? So we have to do something differently, otherwise we are going to fall into the same hole. So I think let's look at the crisis, let's look at all the lessons learned, and let's try to reinvent ourselves so that we do things differently in a sustainable way.
Mr. Sirivardhana, take a minute at most, please, and give us final thoughts.
No, in fact, as I earlier also indicated, we are in a kind of a deep crisis. Although we have seen some improvements, but still there are a lot of areas that need attention, very careful attention. And also we have to think about the fact that why we went to the IMF. It's true that we are under an IMF program. Why we went to the IMF program? Because we have not managed our economy in the past in a better manner. So we have to make sure that you manage the economy, and IMF is helping us, and we have to take the charge. And that needs, the support of everyone in the society. And we have seen that, there's a broader bipartisan agreement from the political side as well. And the social support and also the understanding, it's very important, as Shamini mentioned. In fact, we are basically, trying to translate all this into Sinhala and also Tamil, so that many people can understand that. And we have to communicate. I understand, and I agree with the suggestion that communication is very important, and we are going to go ahead with those sort of measures to basically get these reforms done, which are very good for the country. And it is not because IMF is there whether it's IMF there or not, we have to implement all these reforms. And at the same time, the final message is that we should work hard as a country to make sure that this would be the last IMF program. So then we can continue, we should be able to continue from there onwards. And that would be the, the approach that we have to take as a country if you have to come up with this very deep crisis, and also not to incur or not to recur this in the future again. Thank you.
So Dr. Kure, Aruni, Mr. Sirivardhana, Ustav, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much for that insightful conversation. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our audience. We have over 100 participants joining us virtually, and also thank you very much for your active participation. And ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for a special address on the IMF's Extended Fund Facility Arrangement for Sri Lanka. And to deliver this special address, I kindly invite Ms. Sarwat Jahan, the IMF Resident Representative for Sri Lanka.
Thank you. It is indeed a privilege to be here participating at ADB's Serendipity Knowledge Program. I'm the speaker that is keeping you from lunch, so I've been told to do the IMF program in exactly 10 minutes. So with that, let me start on what the program is about. On March 20th, the IMF Executive Board had approved the program for Sri Lanka. Immediately afterwards, within a couple of hours, all the program documents were available online, and this is exactly what the main page in the staff report looks like. I realized that the title of the staff report is quite large, as is our staff report itself. Now I know it's 151 pages long, and I can confidently say that not everyone in the room or online have read every page. So let me take this opportunity and provide a synopsis of what the program is. First, let's start with what the program strategy is. This program actually has key 5 pillars. The first pillar is on fiscal consolidation. Sri Lanka ranks among the top 5 countries in respect of its tax revenue to GDP ratio. In fact, at the end of 2022, the tax to GDP ratio was only about between 8 to 9% of GDP. So it's not surprising that this fund program would focus on fiscal consolidation. And here we've mainly looked at revenue-based fiscal consolidation with the aim to convert the primary deficit that Sri Lanka currently has into a surplus over the course of the program. Addition to looking at revenue measures, we're also looking at fiscal structural reforms. And what this really means is that we're looking at other sectors that has a drain on public finances. For example, we've been looking a lot into cost recovery for energy pricing reforms, particularly in fuel and electricity. Also a part of the fiscal reforms is to look into ways to help the poor and the vulnerable. And here we really wanted to ensure that enough resources was allocated so that the poor and the vulnerable would receive adequate cash transfers in a meaningful way. The second part is to restore public debt sustainability. As you know, that Sri Lanka in last April had announced a debt moratorium on its debt service. So that within the course of the program, we would like to see measures so that Sri Lanka's debt can once again become sustainable. With high rates of inflation in some months exceeding 60 to 70%, it was necessary to put in policies that would restore price stability. And with depleted reserves, it was also important to ensure that throughout the program period, external buffers will be rebuilt. Financial stability, of course, is a critical part of the program. And then finally, but equally important, is to ensure that the corruption vulnerabilities are reduced and Sri Lanka undertakes growth-enhancing reforms. Turning to program modalities, okay, the program is about $3 billion. It will last 4 years or 48 months, and disbursement will happen on semi-annual tranches over the course of 4 years. What is a bit different about this program than what we had before is that it is budget support. And this was done so that the government does not have to depend on monetary financing for its expenditures, which would have an impact on inflation. The program can also be divided into actually 2 phases. First is the initial stabilization phase. And what we mean by that is we really want to tackle the root causes of the crisis and rebuild confidence. For example, undertake strong revenue measures or ensure central bank autonomy. But also, a part of the program, it is very important to ensure that there is long-lasting institutional building. And it is necessary because we want to ensure that the country has long-term macroeconomic stability as well as debt sustainability. Of course, any reforms depend on strong ownership of the authorities, and it has to be very carefully sequenced throughout the program. There was a lot of talk about what are the prior actions under the IMF program. In Sri Lanka, as with any fund program, before we can go to the board, the countries usually undertake some strong reforms to show their commitment into turning the trajectory of the country into a good outcome. Here we've listed all the 9 prior actions that the authorities completed before we went to the board. I won't go through each and every prior action, but what I will do is group them into a few parts. The first 3 actually talks about fiscal consolidation. So there were reforms that were targeted to increase revenues. There was also reforms that aimed at, prior actions that aimed at the budget to ensure that revenue and expenditures target were within the program parameters. The second set is actually what we call the fiscal structural reforms. So we wanted to ensure that there would be cost recovery in fuel and energy pricing. The next one is actually prior action on the Central Bank Act. Here, this prior action actually fulfills a lot of the pillars that we had shown earlier. For example, the Central Bank Act would help with price stability, but would also help with good governance. The next 2 actually talks about financial stability. So as a part of the prior actions, the authorities undertook the Banking Act. It also looked into banking sector diagnostics. And finally, there was a prior action on monetary policy to ensure that there would be price stability. So up to now, these prior actions have been completed, and these prior actions helped us to go to the board. And the next part, I'm sure that everyone's more interested in is what happens next. So to answer that question of what happens next, I'll go through 4 slides. In any fund program, we have something called quantitative targets or quantitative performance criteria. For these quantitative performance criteria, we do actually have solid numbers that were discussed with the authorities. And for every program review, in the case of Sri Lanka, every 6 months, Sri Lanka's performance will be evaluated on whether these quantitative targets were reached or not. So let me just quickly go through some of the targets. For example, on the quantitative performance criteria, we talk about the primary balance. We also want the authorities to increase international reserves. There's a target on net credit to the government, as is a target on expenditure arrears. There is a target on new external payment arrears. What this means is that in fund programs, during the course of the program, Sri Lanka cannot have new external arrears. There's also projections on inflation, and these are also a part of the quantitative targets. And not only will we have projections on inflation, but we will have bands around the inflation target. And finally, what we have is called indicative targets. Here we look at the central government's tax revenue, their social spending floor, the non-commercial obligations for fuel and energy, and treasury guarantees. The one other part that I would like to highlight to you is the dates that we see. Now, Sri Lanka is on a semi-annual review, so that means that every 6 months, hopefully when the targets are met, we will go to the board with the staff report, and the board will judge or deliberate on Sri Lanka's performance. So we have targets actually for March, June, September, and December. So not only do we have the 6-month review, but in between, we also want to see if Sri Lanka is on the right track. In addition to the quantitative targets, we have structural benchmarks, which are reforms that cannot be quantified. So first, let me pull up the structural benchmarks on fiscal SOEs and the social safety net. As you can see, there's quite a bit of structural reforms here, but that is also because Sri Lanka finds itself in a deep economic and humanitarian crisis, and in order to turn the country around, it will take an effort, a deep effort. And so these are the reforms that we have outlined for the course of the program. As you can see, the top 2 reforms are actually continuous. That means that cost recovery for fuel and energy pricing has to be done throughout the program. And there are other structural reforms. For example, on protecting the poor and the vulnerable, there's a structural benchmark on welfare benefit payment scheme that has to be done, and that will happen next month at the end of May. In our program documents, we have listed all structural benchmarks that has to be completed throughout the year. So as you can see, we have gone all the way up to the end of December, where we even talk about a new public finance management law. Now, our structural benchmarks not only focuses on the fiscal SOE or social safety nets, we also have it for other sectors as well. For example, on the monetary and exchange rate policies, a new central bank would be in place by the end of April. For the financial sector, there's quite a bit of structural reforms. Let me draw your attention, for example, to the first one, where it is necessary to complete the asset quality review component of the bank diagnostics exercise, and it is to be completed by the end of this month. Here again, I think this is quite an important structural benchmark because it not only showcases the structural benchmark that the authorities are going to implement, but it also shows collaboration among different IFIs. For example, this asset quality review is being here, ADB is a key player working with the central bank to complete the asset quality review diagnostic. For the financial sector, we also have quite a few other structural benchmarks, including the Banking Act, which should be completed by the end of December. And then finally, there's the structural benchmarks on governance. Many of you were very helpful to the governance diagnostic mission that was in Colombo just this past week. And as we had said during those missions, that the publication of this report will take place by the end of September. So these are actually the actions, whether it is quantitative targets or the structural benchmarks, that the authorities will be implementing. But then there's a big question on debt sustainability. In the course of the program, the idea is to put public debt into a sustainable path. And what the IMF, in the case of Sri Lanka, looks at is 3 key variables: the public debt to GDP ratio, the gross financing needs, and the foreign exchange debt service. So to give you a comparison, the current situation of public debt to GDP at end 2020 for Sri Lanka was 128% of GDP. The target is to ensure that debt falls to below 95% of GDP by 2032. For the gross financing needs, currently Sri Lanka is at a very high level at about 35% of GDP, and the target is to ensure that it falls below 13% of GDP on average during the time of 2027 to 32. Similarly, for debt service, currently it's about 9.4% of GDP, the foreign exchange debt service, and the aim again is to bring it below 4.5% of GDP during 27 to 32. The question is, these targets, how can Sri Lanka achieve them? And the answer is, well, it's twofold. First, Sri Lanka really does have to commit to its policy reforms. For example, the tax policy will really help to improve the deficit, the fiscal deficit, which in turn will have an impact on debt, or also to take growth-enhancing reforms that will help increase GDP, that will help increase income for the country. But Sri Lanka is now at a stage where it really can't do it all alone. So what it needs is the support of its creditors. So the next step that Sri Lanka also has to do is to negotiate a swift and timely debt restructuring strategy. The good part is Sri Lanka has already received specific and credible financing assurances from its official bilateral creditors, and it is currently doing good faith negotiations with its commercial creditors. These two elements helped Sri Lanka to go to the IMF board. But then more needs to be done for the next stage. And the commitments that Sri Lanka has undertaken under the fund program is to transparently achieve a debt resolution consistent with the IMF program parameters, which will ensure that there is equitable debt sharing among all its creditors. Sri Lanka will refrain from resuming debt service payments to any creditor unless it has agreed to a comprehensive debt treatment in line with IMF program parameters. It has committed to debt sustainability targets, and it will abide by the comparability of treatment principle. And then the next big target, which I'm sure many of you are looking forward to, is at the end April announcement on the coverage and the parameters of the external and domestic debt operations. This is the last slide, and I wanted to end with a little bit of capacity development activities that that has been already undertaken and will continue throughout the fund program. So for this, let me quickly draw up the 5 pillars that we started with under the program. So the first pillar had to do with fiscal issues and fiscal consolidation, and the second pillar had to do with debt sustainability. I put them two together to show how the IMF is actually assisting Sri Lanka with its various technical assistance, so Sri Lanka can build up the capacity to actually meet the various reform targets. So for example here, under the fiscal, the IMF has already delivered quite a lot of technical assistance in tax policy or VAT, excise tax, in revenue administration and public finance management. I also would like to draw your attention to the fact that in many of the IMF-led technical assistance, we have benefited from the expertise of our colleagues at the ADB or World Bank. For example, the Tadat mission or the debt management missions, TA missions, benefited from experts from the ADB and World Bank. I will not go through all other TAs that we have, but you can see from the list that we have outlined here, there has been quite a bit of TA. The one point where I would like to draw your attention to is data analysis. Any policy depends critically on good, accurate, timely data. So the IMF has put in a lot of emphasis on data issues, and here you can see that we have already delivered on government finance statistics or on the real sector, and we have even helped with doing analysis through our model-based financial programming policies. So with this, let me end here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Johan, for that special address. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we have come to the end of today's proceedings. Let me kindly invite Mr. Anuradha Kumarasiri, Director General of National Planning Department, to present the closing remarks on behalf of the Sri Lankan government.
Good afternoon. I think we have kept you another half an hour. We are very sorry. But anyway, good discussion we had. And we have to thank all the panelists, as well as the speakers, as well as online speakers. And also, without you, without participants from the government, the ADB, all the development partners with us, and civil society and all the other SOEs, representatives, virtually as well as physically. I have to special thank goes to the our ST, Secretary to the Treasury. He was here entire half a day, and without his busy schedule, I know what he is having work, task, problems, issues, challenges. But even though he was here with us throughout, and country director from ADB, who organized this event with the NPD. This is the 5th event we organized last 2 years, and always we take good opportunity to discuss with the intellectuals and the expert in the sector area for the betterment of Sri Lanka. This is the good time with the ADB Outlook 2023 and focusing Sri Lankan economic crisis. I think all the panelists, all the participants, all the colleagues, our expectation, future expectation is we are always, of course, optimistic. But we have a lot of challenges. After listening to the Sarvas, speech, presentation, long way to go. And, but IMF is helping us. But as a government, as a country, as a citizen of Sri Lanka, we have to have our own expectation and challenges. We have to face it. That's what today's discussion. I think everyone is expecting betterment of Sri Lanka, and also we have seen the ADB outlook gives us maybe good expectation. 2023 little bit difficult, but we are expecting from 2024 onwards, we will be able to at least manage our country as we expect. But beyond that, hopefully, Sri Lanka will be in good shape, and we will have to have a hard work coming years to achieve our success. Thank you very much, everyone, and ADB with us today. And we are expecting another event, Serendipity Knowledge Program, coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kumarsiri. To present the closing remarks on behalf of ADB, I invite Mr. Kenichi Yukiyama, Director General of South Asia Department of ADB, who will be joining us virtually from India.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Yukiyama, if you can switch on your video. Thank you.
Yes, I hope my video is also seen.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, good afternoon, Governor Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Secretary to the Treasury, esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, and colleagues. Let me begin by congratulating Sri Lanka's leadership for securing approval of the IMF Extended Fund Facility recently. This is a key milestone in Sri Lanka's past was stabilizing the economic situation and charting a new course of recovery and growth. I thank the governor for the lessons learned since the crisis, and also enjoyed the in-depth discussion which took place during the panel discussions, as well as key features of the IMF program by IMF Resident Representative. If I can take a moment to summarize what I picked up, a few points. A clear theme from all the panelists was the need for the continuation and the sustainability of the reforms initiated by Sri Lanka. While the approval of the IMF program is a significant achievement, however, the hard work for the government and the people continues, and there will definitely be challenges ahead. On the public financial management side, fiscal consolidation, SOE reforms, strong governance framework, and expenditure management are priorities. Relatedly, today's discussion also highlights that Sri Lanka must protect the poor and the vulnerable. On this point, I think it's also important to acknowledge and feel for the significant pains that people are enduring over the past 1 year and a half, and on the need to make the ongoing reform programs pro-growth and oriented, and propose as much as possible, like preserving investments generating labor income to the poor and with high multiplier impacts. I understand that this is fully under consideration, but would still be worth mentioning as an important point. In this context, I fully concur with Dr. Curry on the need for getting people's support and confirmation by a Treasury Secretary. Mr. Gunetti rightly pointed out the key concerns on the banking sector. ADB is closely monitoring the sector and will work together to support the reforms as envisaged in the IMF EFF program for enhancing stability and resilience, including greater central bank autonomy. Structural reforms in the area of trade and investment, measures addressing Sri Lanka's vulnerabilities to climate change and corruption will also be a key part of the agenda. At ADB, we remain deeply concerned about the effect on the crisis of the economy and the people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable. In this respect, I'm pleased to note that ADB was able to provide $333.9 million repurposed from ongoing projects to provide emergency support to the most poor, vulnerable segments of the population, including SMEs and farmers. We are also providing guarantees to help keep critical international trade moving through the trade, through our trade and supply chain finance program. Going forward, ADB is ready to support building resilience, implementing reforms, and accelerating recovery, ensuring the protection of the poor. ADB assistance will pivot towards supporting the government's reform agenda by working closely with the government and the development partners and identify the areas where we can support in the country's reforms and lay foundation for resilient, inclusive, and green recovery and growth acceleration. In this context, the right tools and knowledge will be instrumental in devising a new development framework for Sri Lanka. Knowledge sharing events such as today's SKOP event allow for exchange of ideas and provide a platform of communication. Incidentally, ADB is actively joining knowledge process of ongoing G20 finance track dialogue in India, where I'm speaking from, on financing future cities theme as knowledge partner. By compiling practical sets of instruments, methodologies, and steps to build capacities and mobilize municipal resources from affordable segments of the society and help cities grow on its own, which I understand is also a theme of this extended finance program. And we are willing to provide necessary support in the context of our urban sector operations. This is a kind of growth pattern which has been observed in many developed as well as advanced middle-income countries. In conclusion, the coming months will undoubtedly be crucial for Sri Lanka. I reiterate that ADB stands steadfast ready in our support during this time, and I thank you for taking the time for participating in our SKOP ADO 2023 launch program. I wish you all the very best and look forward to engaging with you very closely again in the next edition of SKOP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yokoyama. And with that, we'd like to wrap up today's proceedings. I hope today was an informative day for you all, providing much to ponder upon, and in particular, a glimmer of hope for our economy during these difficult times. Thank you very much for your active participation, and I'd like to invite you for some refreshments outside, and have a pleasant day. Thank you.